so you wouldn't be paying a huge amount of personal property tax. The question becomes, how do you know about it? How do you find out about it?
I don't think there is any way you can intrude on a person to get that information, other than, they do what they do. It's just like, somebody may have a storefront, all right, to have customers come and go. But they may do the bulk of their business at home as a convenience. The town gets its taxes based on what, the person's income,
No.
Real estate value.
well, real estate value.
And personal property.
And personal property,
property
well,
taxes.
personal property would only be included on the business portion though, right?
Right.
Not their own personal, whatever,
It's a misnomer, but
Right.
it should be business property.
property, right. So that's, it's a really, it's an intrusive type of thing, where how far can the town, state, or anybody else intrude in somebody's life? There's gonna be limits.
Part of the answer might be in number 6, which is you can have a sign. So if you have a sign, then that's the equivalent of the storefront. That draws attention to the fact that you are operating a business out of your home. If whatever it is you are doing does not require a sign, and therefore does not require people coming to your home, then it's sort of an invisible home occupation, and maybe we don't need to worry about it, because it's not gonna be one of those things that
All you
causes
have
a
to do is not
conflict.
have a sign though. I can tell you about two auto car shops that don't have signs.
Good
They're
for
home
you.
occupations. They don't have signs,
Well,
and they don't advertise.
a
It's all word of mouth.
couple of consistent themes, if you read through all of these different towns, is the desire not to violate the quiet enjoyment of your neighbors' homes. And B, that it seems to be primarily focused on the external factors of running a business from your home. The number of employees, the number of vehicles, people coming and going, so on and so forth. I mean, deliveries, even if you're a psychiatrist or a psychologist and things like that, and that.
Things that would visit disturbance in those neighbors. Right.
Possibly.
Back to the first point, really.
Right, so, in terms of using your computer to telecommute, that probably since it's not mentioned any place in all the places, in all the different towns that I, there are ordinances that I looked at, that isn't referenced. What it really is concerned with, how much activity you have going on, how much is visible, and how much that violates the neighborhood, its ambiance, and, to make it something other than a residential, community. And the other thing is that a couple of the towns deal with the issue of businesses being grandfathered. And I think I discussed that with you when I first joined the board, that in New Hampshire, there are, because of the change in the demographics and the increase in property values, that the use of property has changed over the last even 15 years. And so the way some of these towns are dealing with it, Exeter is one, but there are other towns as well. Brentwood is another, for instance, in New Hampshire, that if they find that your business gets to a point where it's either too intrusive or violating really the tenor of what a home business is supposed to be, they basically say that you can operate, but if you go to sell it, that the permit to operate that business in that location, it applies to you.
Expires.
And it
You can't sell
expires
it.
when you sell the property. And so you could take somebody's book of business elsewhere, but you don't get to use that location any longer for that use. And so that's a way of sort of splitting the baby, so to speak. So the individual who owns the property can continue to operate their business, but because of the change in, property values, demographics, and other factors, you don't necessarily get to sell that business to operate in that particular location. So these are all considerations, I
So
think.
your first point basically gets summed up in good neighbor policy.
But,
in
I
terms
mean,
of not.
sometimes you can't depend on something, you know, as
But that-
nebulous.
No, I'm not suggesting that as
Subjective
the written
stuff.
word for this, but that's the concept
Hmm.
that we're looking at. It's basically a good neighbor policy, that if what you are doing is sufficiently unobtrusive, so as not to impact your neighbors, then it's okay. But at the point where it spills over, either because of noise or pollutants or traffic or what have you, then it's the problem.
And the spilling over and defining what constitutes an accepted amount of traffic and change to a residential property is pretty consistent from town to town. And that seems to be what they're most focused on. That's Kennebunkport, York, Wells, Algonquin, Exeter, Brentwood, Los Angeles. It's pretty consistent across the board.
I think I'd take Los Angeles out of that group. just
Well,
because
what I'm saying
What
is,
doesn't fit?
the idea of, you know, not violating the quiet enjoyment of the neighborhood, so.
But defining what that is always the issue.
Well, look at what some of these other,
Yeah,
how much
they
time they
define what it
take
is.
to define it and how definitive our list is. It's deliberately probably vague in order to give, you know, to allow for, you know, a lot of flexibility, which has probably served the community well up to now. Or maybe it continues to serve the community, you know, that's a matter of opinion.
Yeah, we have a third factor that has entered into the fray as well, and that is our building code, IBC. Because IBC basically requires as soon as you have a non-residential use, the use group of that structure has changed from a residential to a mixed use. And there are separation and use group factors that you have to take into account. You have to modify that space depending on what the use is, in order to meet the building code. So the building inspector gets involved in this, in a home occupation, depending on what the nature of the activity is.
Where does that say that here?
It doesn't, it says in the building code.
But every one of these, for every town, says that the home, you know, occupation has to be permitted.
Yes.
That is the,
That answers all the issues here.
that is the final,
Yeah.
you know,
You have to get it.
rule.
Right.
You have to get a permit. That is number Z, or letter Z, rather, not to use a mixed metaphor. You must get a permit.
And I don't know if I'm, I don't know, I find it hard pressed to try to impose new construction things on somebody who simply wants to. Okay, so I'm working in my house and I wanna make soap and sell soap out of my house, bars of soap. Which, believe me, I can do. At work, I sell hundreds of them. And I live in an old house. Why in the world would I have to modify my house to make soap?
Because that's what the building code, that's something that we had nothing to do with, that's the building code that, I don't know who put that together.
Right,
Well, that's the
what
state,
I'm-
let's move back, that's the state.
what I'm saying is, if we're gonna look at this, and we have particular issues with it, then look at the whole thing. Should you have to take a home occupation for something that's not going to impact the living quarters or the house itself, and impose new building rules? You know, I could see if they wanna do kids in their house, and there may be safety issues, you may wanna bring certain things up to code, and there's certain things they have to do. But I think you have to kinda look at the situation. And maybe what we have just isn't, I don't know the word for it.
Definitive enough.
Right, so it's not specific enough about when, where, why, and how. And I'm not, you know, we've talked about this many times about taking these different things and making them in their own categories. And I think this is another good example of something that needs to be in its own category.
You're not suggesting we list out, start taking different businesses and trying to put them
No.
in different tiers?
No, no,
Oh,
no,
my
no,
Lord,
no.
we'll keep
No,
it forever.
No, what I'm saying is that it should have its own section
That's fine.
in the land use regulations with the different things that impact it.
I think to your point, I think we really, I believe we should take the least restrictive approach to assuring the objective of just keeping neighbors from being disturbed.
Yep.
We ought to keep that as a sort of a point of reference for the objective and just use.
If we're going to do that, then I think we need to look at, I don't know which number it was, one of the conditions that we're always having to vote on, you know, dust, noise, odor, I think visual has to be added to that.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think you need a buffer, you know, especially with a business that somewhat would become obtrusive to somebody else who owns a piece of property and abutting to it,
Mhm.
you know? I mean, I butt up to people, they don't bother me because I don't go looking for them, but, you know, they're far enough back, they're invisible, and as long as they're not cutting trees on my property, I'm okay, you know? So, that's one of the key things here. And going back to this, you know, how much soap somebody makes in their house, a crafter is gonna do crafter things in their home. If I'm a crafter and I start having semis pull up 3 and 4 times a week to load them up, I'm not exactly, you know, the little arts and show crafter anymore. Something else is going on in my
No,
property.
because you'd be at more than 25%.
Exactly, I would have to be using the
was
entire
thinking
house and
more
sleeping
along
on
the
the couch.
lines of somebody who's an auto mechanic and works out of his garage. And I had a friend of mine down in Biddeford for 30 years, worked out of his garage. You'd bring your car, he'd take it in, he'd fix it, he'd come back and get it and go home. He never stored his cars outside, ever.
Right,
They were in his garage. I think, you know, if you're an automobile mechanic and it stays in the garage, then it's not creating a visual impact on your neighbors.
right, if you have a facility, if you had a garage like 3 days and you didn't have any more than 3 cars, you know, there as customers, nobody, you know,
No air wrench.
would know whether they're your cars or somebody else's cars in reality, other than, you know, you being an honest person and reporting your income and what you're doing to earn a living. So, and you wouldn't wanna run that person out of town. You know, they're a productive tax-paying person that's paying taxes.
And to me, that goes back to the visual impact. You get done with that car, you call the guy up, he comes, he takes the car out of your garage, and then you can put somebody else in there. You don't leave the cars stacked up in your yard waiting for people to come and get them.
Right, exactly. I mean,
Then it
this
creates a problem.
this is kind of the problem when you deal with everybody, you know, how much, you know, especially in a residential section, or that's something that's heavily residential, it's kinda like, okay, I'm gonna give you the Sinnott Road where I live. I'm pretty good with the amount of traffic on Sinnott Road, but I get a little scared as bigger and bigger semis are flying by me at 70 miles an hour when I go to my mailbox. You know, I mean, it's just a purely stupid thing, because that car will kill me just as well as that semi, but I'm just seeing myself wrapped up in the tire of the semi, you know? And then I go, okay, now my mailbox gets taken out with mirrors a lot more often, but luckily I manufacture my mailbox in a way, it always takes the mirror off the truck, so they don't do that a second time.
I think the issue that we have to decide on, because we can look at this, we can go through all of this, are home occupations permitted, or do they need to be permitted?
That's the first issue you gotta decide.
We have to decide
Then you
that
need to
issue.
think about
We
what
can go through everything
standards you
else.
wanna place on it. But first, is it permitted use, or does it need a permit from our code enforcement officer or staff?
I think it needs a permit, either from staff or from the Board of Selectmen. You give them a license fee.
No, I
No, not the
don't know.
board of selectmen.
Okay.
I think if you're gonna do a permit,
Yeah,
I think
for
you,
you
No,
personally.
no.
if you're gonna do a permit, I think it has to have a very set process.
Sure.
And I think that it should go through the people who deal with permits every single day.
It needs to have the same kind of set process as someone coming in front of the Board of Selectmen. Here's the application, here's what I need to do in order to get that permit.
So on page 2 of the York ordinance, it says in 7.4.3, it says types of home occupations permitted. Now, I'm assuming it's, we can get into the semantics, but does that mean you permitted without a permit, or that these are require a permit.
You can't tell from.
Can't tell.
You can't tell from the language, so, because it's odd
There
that
could
they
be
would,
some, of course, in the ordinance that deal with what
Right,
you have to do.
right.
Yeah.
so,
Could we potentially come up with one or two maybe three factors that split home occupations into those that require a permit and those that do not?
Yes.
And the ones that do not are basically invisible home occupations.
I think you're gonna have to go to that point personally, because it's an economic threshold. If somebody's earning a living, all right, and they're not making a large sum of money, let's say they're making $40,000 in our town by surviving, by doing something in their home and selling something out of their home, whether it's going to a craft show or whatever. There's a threshold of how much intrusion the town would be able to do on them with, you know, they're gonna go get a lawyer and go, you're running me out of town.
I don't think it's so much, an economic issue, I think it's more what Donna is onto, and that is, can you know about it if you're outside of the house? If you don't,
That's right, that's what I'm getting at, that's what I'm getting at. You're not gonna get that person to go get a
The
permit.
problem with the economic issue is, who makes that decision? I
how
don't
do you
wanna see
find
your
out,
tax
and how do you find
return.
that out?
We're never gonna
How do you
have
find that out?
It can't be
Without being,
economic
without
decision.
being
No, because
unreasonably
everybody
No,
who has a
but if,
computer in
if
their
I
house,
wanted
you
to use
claim
my,
that they
my
have a
property
home
for a
business.
contractor's yard, okay, and park vehicles there and everything else, then I would have to definitely come to the town, because everybody's gonna know about that, right?
Mhm.
You know, if I'm not, and I'm not, nobody's gonna know what's going on, and I'm being a quiet, good neighbor, who's gonna know anything about it,
You know,
really?
For example, you take two of the things that we've discussed, okay? You take someone who's like making soap, and they make soap in their house and they just go to craft fairs.
Yep.
They don't do a lot in the house, there's not a lot of traffic in the house. Most of the time, they're just taking it, selling it at craft fairs. Versus someone who's, say, doing construction out of, no, they're doing automotive repair out of the garage. Okay? This one needs very minimal overseeing.
None.
Yeah,
No.
I mean,
Right.
really. But I'm trying to be,
But if it doesn't violate the visual consistency of the outside of the structure of the
well, there's,
residence, and you don't really know that they're there, and it still looks like a house and everything, it looks like it conforms with the rest of the neighborhood, why is that in violation?
Who cares?
Right.
well, no,
Right.
that's,
I think
No, that's what I'm saying.
That's pretty much what York was saying with their visual appearance.
Right,
that's what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say that, with this one that makes the soap versus this one who has the automotive garage, okay? With the automotive garage, there are other factors that need to be taken into consideration. You might have your standards for building, fire safety issues, to make sure that there's nothing. So, I think Donna's right, I think that there are probably two classifications of home occupations, and they probably require two different, I think they both would require a permit.
No,
You would think that the little ones, the,
no,
okay,
If-
so the
if
ones
I'm
that are just doing
something in
crafts
my
and
ha- If I'm doing something in my house, and the only way you know I'm doing it is if I tell you, then I have no
and I'm
impact,
fine with that,
and then I have no impact on anybody.
Agreed.
and
How
I'm
would
fine
my
with that.
assessor know what you've got for
What-
personal
So,
property?
no, but that's a collateral objective, and I don't think that's,
No, but it's an objective, it has to, you know, if we're gonna be equal, it's still an objective that has to be met.
Well, I
Pretty
think that's,
equal.
but that's
But
the
you're
question
not-
of-
but
If
you're
do
not
it to
gonna
run
get
a
anything
machine,
from
You gotta do it
those.
to another business, right?
So does that mean you're gonna tax crafters?
What are you gonna
Yeah.
tax them on?
I want you, I wanna see anybody take on the little old ladies who knit in this town. Good luck.
Well, there's not gonna be a lot there, is there?
And-
But if you are commercial,
But
my
I,
brother is a, he builds furniture commercially, in his basement, okay? And he has been doing it for 25 years, okay? He gets taxed on all of his equipment, because he's a home
Well,
occupation.
He's running a legitimate business.
He's running a legitimate business, and he's a crafter.
But I can't
Years of
imagine his
record.
taxes are that much because they
They aren't,
depreciate every year.
they aren't, the depreciation's hideous,
So-
but he still has to make the report every year.
Right, but
But
what
all
we're
these
talking about
Why
is
is
so
that a good thing?
Specific
minuscule.
examples are
Why is it
such
a
a
good thing?
Why do
slippery
we,
slope.
why do we have to
We
do that?
need generic,
Why do
Just
we
to-
have to do
Yeah,
that?
just to raise revenue?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kinda why
Yeah.
we
Good
have
thing then.
taxes.
Well, it is a good thing, but is that what we're here to do, is to
No,
raise
that's what
revenue?
I'm here.
Or that's, cause that's
All
that's
this
a
does
side
is
thing.
get the information.
It gets the information and that decision goes to these guys,
Okay.
and how they wanna handle that.
so,
In some cases, it's just written off.
so
Very honestly.
all these
It's not worth
ordinances,
even
they
billing.
talk about employees, they talk about storage
Right.
on the property, they talk about the, visual, consistency, with its surroundings. I mean, they're pretty specific in a generic way, and why couldn't we be equally, I know it's a paradox, but generic and
would-
specific at the same time?
We would have to be, because one of the things it talks about here is storage of, it actually doesn't talk about storage of product or materials, it talks about the
Inventory.
sale of that, but it doesn't really discuss the inventory that you would have on premises.
Which to me doesn't matter unless it's stored outside, and it's potentially a visual blight for your neighbor.
Right, and it
Yeah.
talks about outdoor activity or storage of materials shall be permitted, but it's limited in terms of the amount of area that's allowed to occupy.
Right, what,
And then you also have trip generation as
What-
a result.
And they
What
talk
if?
about that too.
Yeah, I know, that's the issue. Right now, we have 40 trips per day,
Which is a lot.
which is huge. It's
Yeah.
immense. We have retail stores that don't have 40 trips a day. So the fireplace didn't have a store that didn't have 40 trips a day, which is probably why it's not there.
if you have a home occupation that involves, and I just made a quick list while I was listening to everybody mention things, that involves a sign, visual impact for your neighbors, or something that would need buffering, employees, storage of materials outdoors, and some of these obviously overlap, parking for customers or increased traffic.
How about noise?
Good.
And what about,
Odors,
odors and debris?
then you need a permit. And if you don't have any of those factors, or any others we add to the list as we think more, you're not impacting anybody, who knows what you're doing?
And I think in that situation, you get a permit from the code enforcement officer, just a regular building permit. Just so we know you're there, so you know,
I mean, for that list that I just went down?
just a building permit,
Okay.
which is like $25 for that use. I think that would be an appropriate, that's not an intrusion.
So what's the carrot and stick to get people to do that? And what happens when they don't?
Then you get an 80K, we wanna do that? That's the stick, the big stick is an 80K. You
What-
know,
what
notice
is-
of
what is that?
Notice of violation,
Thank you.
And the,
which in
Yeah.
most cases, all you have to do is send a letter.
and the.
You don't have to get the attorneys involved, you send a letter and say, you're in violation, come fix that, come get a permit. You know,
And the inducement or the notice to people that are here now, or even people who are moving in, that they gotta do this is,
I would think that for the people that are here now, we would do it the same way we did with contractor yards. We would notify everybody and say, you have to come in and register your yard, and everybody's gonna be happy, you just have to come in and tell us you're there. Don't make us look for you, because if we have to go looking for you, or we find out that you're there 3 years after the fact, well, you can't be there anymore.
You know, and building inspectors, not that Jim Nagel needs to have more to
Oh.
do, but they do make random, you know, there are moments when perhaps Jim or his underlings, if he ever has more underlings, can make random, you know, you can make a random stop and just kind of, you know, make an assessment of what's going on the property. I mean, a lot of venues
No,
do
no,
that.
we don't do
No.
that, that's, we don't stop in.
We really
I-
don't have the
We don't,
manpower
we
for
don't,
that.
We don't have the manpower, and there's a question, a legal question, whether you have a problem with us.
If you have a current,
Well, but
If
if
you
you
have a
can
current
see it from
building
the
permit, you
street,
can.
I'm not talking about knocking on their door
Okay,
and asking for a personal tour of
or
their,
walking onto the property.
No,
You
but
could
if-
actually do that, they can send it to, it's fine.
yeah.
Yeah, that's fine, yeah.
But, I mean, if you see it from the street and you see a lot of activity and you happen to notice people coming and going and things being dumped and things being picked up and whatever, I mean, there's no reason why you can't make note of that.
and if that's the case, you're probably gonna have a complaint that's gonna
That's
warrant,
exactly right.
that's gonna
That's
warrant
usually
somebody
how it
going
happens.
out.
Somebody will feed into that.
And if you have a current open permit, he can come in, he can find my house.
Yes, exactly.
I
But
know he does,
won't.
'cause you
But-
have
But
updated
you know he won't,
pictures.
he'll call you beforehand.
No, he doesn't call me,
He didn't call you?
he doesn't have to.
He doesn't have to, but he usually does.
I only know it because I had an updated picture of the house on my tax thing, that's the only
That's
reason I knew.
Beth, that's a different story. But Beth does walk into the property.
I wanna
But-
throw one thing in on this, because it's, you know, I don't do it, I don't have a lot of friends. But, what would you do? What would you do in the case where somebody is not really charging somebody for something? Let's say he's got his friends coming over, they're working on his cars in a garage. It's not a
That's-
business.
that's-
It's not
You can't do anything about it, it's not a
That's
home
not a
occupation.
Yeah, but it can be perceived as a business, right?
Well, then you tell
They
your neighbors to
investigated
mind
and
their
found
own
that
business.
not to be.
Well, yeah, I mean, if they're,
That's all.
They file a complaint, somebody goes and investigates and says, no, I just had a bunch
It's
of
a
my
hot-
friends over and we were fixing up the hot rod.
Yeah, go away.
Okay, go away.
And then you put up a big fence.
Well, I think we need
I
to
don't
put
know
up
if you need to
defenses
do that or
out
not,
there.
I'm just saying, when we were talking about going out, looking at people.
Protecting the Harrison area.
That's
Well,
another
in all
issue.
ways stuff, there is a certain level of common sense that has to prevail. I mean, and it doesn't always happen.
This America,
Can
Well,
we
there
put
is
that
no
in the
common
ordinance,
sense.
please?
It's supposed to be in there.
With common sense, I
Common
failed to
sense,
see that.
there is what's, you know, what is.
So-
So is
let's-
this,
let's-
is this an idea that's sort of gelling, bifurcating it into
Sounds
two
like-
different
Let's-
types?
Let's go back to the basic question. Is it gonna be permitted?
Yes,
Permitted,
yes or no.
Permitted.
licensed, or
Yes.
wady you wanna call it.
Depends, right?
It-
I think they
Well-
should have to have.
Yeah, allowed and some of them permitted.
I think permitted and different levels of permit, that we will always have a registration.
So there's a $25 permit, when you fall under this, you just have to come in and tell them, this is what I'm doing, and you get your permit. Then there's the other level that, you know, you might have a garage and you might have a couple of cars outside, and because it's a garage and you have flammable stuff, they might have to go through a different type of permit.
So
We can
either
work that,
registration
we
or
can work
permit.
that out through the planning board to define what that criteria happens to be. Because the purpose of this meeting is to help, you know, how do we reconcile this to the comp plan? So I think that would be a fairly, because we don't wanna get in, you guys don't wanna get into the weeds, I hope.
I don't think you have to get into the
Oh, no, no,
weeds.
that's,
Oh, it wouldn't be
that's-
the first time
that's-
we've gotten into the weeds.
That's where the planning board comes in, and we look at it and we say, our direction is to create this bifurcated system for home occupation, and we can look at it and say, yeah, you know, be kind of like the state, if you've got 6 kids, you have to get a permit, if you don't have 6 kids, you don't have to.
Your
We
home
could
occupation.
essentially do the same thing, at some point, you're gonna have to come and get the, fall under the regulations, and at another point.
Does
you
that
don't.
fall under our home occupation, if they have under X number
Under
of
5,
kids?
or under, yeah, under
Kids
6.
are a different story,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
childcare. We make that separate because
Okay,
because, you know,
Daycares.
experience has always been that
Yeah.
even if you have 2 kids outside, complaints come in, you wanna notify the abutters this is going. And besides, the state has to come in and inspect anyways.
right, but here is childcare. And that's one of those areas where you would have to have,
Yeah, but
Like
we already,
diff-
that's already in there, we already have that as a completely separate
Yeah, that's
part of
separate,
the
like,
ordinance.
like contractor yards are separate.
but it's under here too.
What are you looking at?
It says L childcare, not more than 3.
But is that Arundel, or is that
No,
some other
that's
town?
probably York or
Oh.
Oh, yeah,
Algonquin
that's not
or
Arundel.
Kennybunk or.
Well, it's hard for me to tell which
Well,
one's which.
I think I say it in the subject line. Most
Well, I didn't do that, I printed out.
Exeter, sorry.
Yeah,
But we
it's actually-
can agree that we want the bifurcated system, right?
I think so,
Okay,
I think
good.
that works.
That'll give us something we can work with.
I think it gives the person who has to review these a little, so that they don't have to spend, 40 hours a week looking at home occupations, cause some of them are pretty easy, and it's like, here you go.
And so we could put something here in the district in permitted uses with an asterisk that says.
Well, if
there
you're
is
gonna
no
have-
asterisk.
If you're gonna have two classifications, you're gonna have to have two definitions.
Yep.
And then list those on the list of either conditional or permitted uses, although I don't know how you're gonna do that if you're still gonna need some permit, even from staff or code enforcement. So,
But for some home occupations, you wouldn't need a permit. The ones that are invisible,
I
that,
thought you said you wanted permits on everything.
no,
Oh, okay.
no, I was distinguishing between permits and permit, that's why I used the word allowed before.
Okay.
They're all allowed. Some of them need to be permitted with
Okay.
a permit.
I would say most or many are allowed.
Well,
not all.
I don't
But
mean
yeah, you know what I
universally,
mean.
but
I
yes.
use the word,
What?
something like registered, which suggests everybody has to be registered, but certain among the registered, as, for example, the signage and the other things that you identified as triggering a requirement for the permit.
Yeah, they're not gonna wanna be registered.
I was just gonna say that there's gonna be a group of these that don't even need to be, the ones that are truly invisible, that have no impact on your neighbors, shouldn't even have to be registered. That will never pass a town meeting. Absolutely
Oh, no,
not.
we can tell you it will not.
Because you have too many people in this town who, whether they are crafters or they're,
Realtors or,
Well,
Well-
and I would agree with that, there's absolutely, you have no visual impact anywhere. And, just back in the seventies, I had a client who made hooked rugs. And he wanted
Sure,
to be
you're gonna say
audited so
Curtis,
bad,
that's it.
we listed it as a hooker, and we still couldn't get it on. She had a couple of mattresses, I mean, this lady created works of art that hung in MoMA and other museums. She was really, really good at it. She had a couple of mattresses, and she was constantly punching holes in them with her needles. That was it, that was her house, that was her office, a spare bedroom. She wouldn't need a permit.
no,
She didn't even sell them and have people come in to buy them.
no, and
Making
if,
up that
and if
list
we
is gonna
attempt
be
to make them
interesting.
get a permit,
That's gonna make
you
it,
won't get anything passed.
Making a list of what, of the.
well, the invisible ones.
well, but you
Oh, no, I
don't list.
Why do we do, why
Well,
do
no.
we need to do that?
You don't list the task.
They identify themselves by what,
Right,
Right.
if you do not have a sign, create visual impact that interferes with your neighbors, have employees, outdoor storage, parking, traffic noise, odor, or debris issues.
in the
We don't-
disjunctive.
Right, yeah, we don't know you're there.
So I
You're
know the
invisible.
brewery guys. Cause the brewery guys had all of that going for them.
Well, no, he wanted to put another building up though.
That's okay, you can do that,
Well, that's true.
cause it says accessory use, so
But
the
he
brewery
can't
guys.
violate the accessory use, he can't have more than 25%.
Yeah, 25% is the limiting factor there.
Right,
He had a big
Depends on
house.
how big his house is.
He had a big house, and he was up in, he had a big house, he was gonna put a little shed in there, he was gonna do a home brewing. I mean, it wasn't home brewing,
and
he was
what
gonna
was-
basically sell that.
My stained glass teacher, her
But you
husband
should have
has
seen the
been
neighborhood come
making
out.
beer for years and nobody even knows
You
it.
should, but this was commercial, he was selling this, he was gonna sell this. This was definitely, you mean, no bones about it, this isn't me doing home brewing, cause I used to do home brewing, I didn't.
Were
have
they
to do
going,
that.
were they going to be selling it at the house? or
Not
were
at
they
the
gonna
house, I'm
be-
gonna sell it wholesale.
I don't have any issue with that.
It's just
If
in the
they're not
neighborhood
doing
went
it at the
nuts.
house,
Well, there would be an issue of coming and going and traffic, and if the volume
Once
got
a
big,
week,
once a week.
once a week, taking a van full of beer out. You ever handcap
The
beers?
neighborhood.
It's horrible.
All
Yeah,
right,
it is.
Tom,
Awful.
you need to jump in here
Why?
and,
But
I mean, all these examples, I mean, I think if we define,
It's a question of definition.
it's
that's all.
definition, yeah, and that's
And
that's why I
we're
said
gonna have
the
fun
invisible,
working that out.
the invisible uses have gotta be defined in some way, otherwise, I don't think, I
Not
honestly
by
don't think
individual
the,
categories, Ben, but defined by the activity and
Right.
what
You
can
can have
do.
sort of
Something
what
with
you have
define-
what
Define them negatively.
isn't that what this is,
That-
or
yes.
by what they're,
Yes.
That's kind of what Donna was saying, yeah.
you
I
can have
agree.
more traffic from somebody who has 3 teenage kids.
Well, they should be permitted.
yes.
I would agree with that.
License
I have
should be
Before
better.
they became teenagers, they should
But-
have.
Bonded.
But you could have more activity in your home from having 3 teenage kids than having somebody deliver to this place or pick up from this place once a week.
And actually,
But it was the concept. I mean, there we notified the neighborhood, because that's what we do when we do permitting. So we notified the neighborhood, all the abutters, and they came out in droves. And this guy actually said, I don't wanna tick off my neighbors. So I'm withdrawing my
But they-
application,
but
and he took it
What
out
we're
of
saying is,
town.
they don't even need to know if they're not impacting those things.
and the other
You
part.
wouldn't believe how news, well, you know how news travels.
But-
News traveled
And a
very
semi
quick.
comes
There's a
once
very
week to
big
pick up your
difference.
product.
There is a
understand what
very
you're saying.
big difference between my finding out that my next door neighbor is brewing beer, big whoopee do. I don't drink beer, but invite me over sometime. Or somebody getting something from the town saying, hey, guess what? Okay, people take those two situations totally different.
That may be, but
And-
it was still the same volume either way.
The other possibility is that had this individual lived in a different neighborhood, nobody would have cared. And I think that's another thing that we need to be aware of as ordinances get written, is the danger of writing an ordinance that either encourages or prohibits particular activities based upon the fact that 6 people didn't like it, because then it affects the entire town. And if you asked another 6 people, they would have said fine. So having a much bigger umbrella of what's fine for the town. I know that's hard to do, but
But
Well,
here they,
it's not really, I mean, you know, it's also sticking to the knitting. I mean, you know, yes, mob mentality can affect the reviewers, but if you stick to the knitting and say, do they meet this standard, do they meet this standard, do they meet this standard? If you
Then
can
it's
stick to
fine.
that knitting, then you're okay.
yeah.
Who
so-
cares what the neighbors say?
And who
But
cares what the neighbors
aren't you gonna
say?
define
comply,
it
you
too by
comply.
what zone? Of what type of
Well,
zoning?
yes, but that's part of the
So
knitting,
part of-
because in
okay.
certain zones it's allowed and in certain zones it's not.
That's right.
Well, now it's getting complex.
Well, but, you know, you have different zones where different things are permitted, and so.
Yeah, but home occupations have typically been allowed in every single zone.
Yes.
And they've not been treated differently.
They were always conditional uses in every single zone.
I know, but how many of them did you ever turn down?
But every town, it's really interesting that they define what kind of, you know, what the zoning is for that particular, you know, for different areas in the town, and what are the permitted
But are they
uses.
specific in the home occupation as to what you can do in this zone and what you can do in that zone?
Yes, yes,
In regards to the specific uses?
yes, certain uses are not permitted in residential areas that are permitted, in, I forget what zones are called, but,
Well, York has,
rural residential
That's a
or
density,
whatever.
that's a density
if you look
problem.
at York has 3 different classes of home occupations based upon square footage. Class 1 has 450 square feet or less, class 2 is 800 square feet or less, and class 3 is 1,600 or less. So they've broken it up based upon the size of the business,
And there's other factors there.
and there are other
Employees, et
factors.
cetera, not-
Employees, type of
Sure,
uses.
I'm not sure that.
Forget
I'm
professional
not sure that I like
offices.
that.
No, I
No.
don't think so.
Well, and that was the purpose of looking at all these different things and taking what we like and leaving the rest, I mean.
But I do like the general standards that York has, with the visual appearance,
Yes.
with signs, retail activity. You know, they've done a pretty good job of defining that area.
And they trifurcated instead of
Right, that's what,
Which
we're
is
just gonna have
good.
two
Yeah,
classes
We're just gonna
instead
have the
of
3
three.
classes.
classes instead of three makes sense.
But in every one of these instances, I mean, they talk about, you know, permitted or more classes permitted by zone. We would probably be looking more at classes permitted by zone,
I don't,
because that's the way the
You're gonna
ordinance
have
is
to
set.
list
But
them
I don't-
as a permitted, as a use on some basis.
Yeah, I think we're gonna have to.
You're gonna have
to.
and
Because I mean, what we have right now is what's traditionally done at home, and
Right.
that is totally useless. Because that could be from, you know, one extreme to the other.
Yep.
It all depends on who's doing the reviewing. And in the past, that has resulted in, you know, different CEOs have made different interpretations, and they aren't consistent, and it's resulted in neighborhood conflict. And the only thing is, in some cases, that some of it's gone away, some of it hasn't, but as we grow, we're starting to see more and more evidence of people being more sensitive, you know, to to non-residential activities
Oh,
occurring.
no, they're way too sensitive.
And we can't
I
control
won't,
that.
I won't disagree, I won't disagree in some cases, but that's expectation.
So
We're moving to a rural community and we shouldn't have to deal with anything but residential quiet.
Well, no, because
And that's the
part of being in a,
expectation.
for this town, and, you know, and this is something that people who are moving in have to accept, that moving into this town, you're moving into a town where home occupations is a big deal.
I'm not saying.
I mean, and if you try to do too much with it and try to restrict it too much, you won't get anything passed. Because a lot of people depend on that for their income.
Agreed.
That's how they live. And, you know, being a bedroom community is one thing, but you can't, I'm not willing to allow people who are moving in to change what people have historically been able to do. And that's why I asked you about, well, did they have a permit or not? Because if they had a permit and the lots next to them split, and the person that split it didn't tell them about it, you know, it's like, and these things drive me crazy all the time, and it doesn't matter what it is. It's like, I think it was Springvale had a rod and gun club. It'd been there for 50 million years. And then someone sold a big tract of land next to it. They built all these houses right up next to it. Next thing you know, the Rod and Gun Club is closed because everybody in the neighborhood complained. That's just downright wrong.
It happened in Cape Woods, though, too.
Yeah, it's wrong.
Well,
Because
well,
you,
the neighborhood, the town to survive has to be flexible enough to move along with changes that are going to occur
See, I
in the
agree with Don.
demographics of the
If you
community.
moved into a,
He knew it
you know,
was
piece
there.
of property
They
and a
knew
gun
it was
club next
there.
to it,
I-
I don't wanna
they
hear that.
purchased
Maybe
their
they-
property
well,
knowing
I'm
it
not,
was
I don't know
there.
anything about this, I'm just saying,
Moving to the nuisance.
That's right.
No,
then they
you
should
moved
never have
into-
gotten a permit for the subdivision in the first place.
No, they could have the.
Well, no, they could have a
can
permit
the
for the
right to
subdivision.
subdivide their land and do all of, everything that they want.
But they don't have a right to
If
intrude the
you're
other
gonna
person.
buy that piece of property, and there's a gun club next to you, I don't want you to complain to me that there's a gun club. He was there when you bought the property.
All I'm saying is that, you know, a certain amount of change occurs, you know, organically. And the town, in order to survive, has to be flexible enough to recognize some of that change and, move along with it. Otherwise, you know, if you're static, ultimately, you don't survive. And I'm not just talking about Arundel, I'm talking about species in and of themselves. If you don't know how to adapt and make it work, then you don't survive.
But
You
you
just don't.
you also have to be very careful about how you do it.
I agree, I
Because-
totally agree.
You know, what one town thinks is great, you know, some people, you know, people in Bedford might think, some people in Bedford might think that Bedford Crossings is the greatest thing after buttered bread. But if you talk to most of the people that live in this town, they're like,
Well, I mean, I'm just talking about Arundel. All I'm saying is that there has to be a certain amount of flexibility, and it only benefits the town to be willing to bend. And I'm not saying necessarily to change, but at least consider who's moving into the town, what money is being spent, how the town is being supported, how those taxes are being gathered, who's paying them, and so on and so forth.
But we have to be careful with that, because from a planning board point of view, we run up against a particular person in this town who thinks that because he pays so much in property taxes, he should be allowed to do stuff that other people aren't.
I think I know who that person is.
And I have issues with that concept.
I do too.
You know, so you have to be very careful when you look at that balancing.
I agree. I'm just saying, you know, you have to be able to adapt as well.
Oh, absolutely, that's why we're
So-
looking at the ordinances and saying, what can we do?
The town shut it down?
Yeah, the town,
Springfield?
yeah.
They really?
Well, that happens quite a bit with airports, you know.
Yep.
People will move in near an airport and that airport will close.
They're having that problem with the
They
benefit.
close
program.
because they get bad press, or they close
No,
because
no,
somebody
they-
shuts them, the
Or
municipality?
noise,
They
or-
generally close because the municipality finally shuts them down as a nuisance.
And is it a nuisance or economically that it doesn't make it either? And
No,
it's-
what they
the land
did is
worth
they
more to
started,
develop.
they started imposing things that they wanted them to do that were so financially not possible.
Right, it restricts the airport's operation
That it-
hours, and finally they can't
They
have a
couldn't,
profit
they
after
couldn't meet
close.
what the town told them that they had to do. So,
That's not proper.
no, it's not.
Well, Bedford,
Okay.
that's municipal airport.
So-
Right.
Yeah.
So,
It's their-
At any rate, we have some stuff that we can work on from home occupations, which will be good.
Can I take a giant step backwards? Sure. The definition we have of home occupations,
I just looked at it.
I would like to make some suggestions.
Okay,
Let's go.
Section 3?
It's on page 15.
Well, if we're gonna have definitions, we have to have a definition of home
But
occupation.
you're gonna have two new ones then.
Right.
That's
No,
going.
I think that this definition fits the purpose that we have. An occupation, profession, activity, or use carried on as an accessory use in a dwelling or structure accessory thereto that is customary, incidental, and secondary to the use of the dwelling unit for residential purposes.
Tell them
And
what
it
you
doesn't
wanted
alter
to
the
change it
residential
to,
character.
Donna, it'll probably make more sense.
Well, what I wanted to do was eliminate 50% of the words, because they're not necessary. If it simply said an occupation or use carried on as an accessory use in a dwelling or structure, accessory thereto that is secondary to the residential purpose, and which does not alter the residential character of the dwelling. Customary, incidental, profession, activity, and use of the dwelling unit for is all unnecessary words. It just makes it hard to read the definition. I will do that again slowly if anybody cares to hear it a second time.
Yeah, no, I can see that. Yeah.
So an occupation,
A use carried on as an accessory use.
yeah, an occupation or use, that's what we're talking about. Because a profession, and profession's the same as occupation, and activity's the same as use. In a dwelling or structure accessory thereto that is secondary to, get rid of customary and incidental. The dwelling unit, secondary to the residential purpose.
And which does not alter the character.
Right.
Yeah.
So it just shortens it up and puts it in simpler English.
Were you gonna use that in the ordinance?
That's
No,
not my job.
That's just the definition.
That's the difference.
But you're gonna take this definition and you're gonna put it in one of these land use tables here.
Why not just change the definition?
Change the definition, you're gonna have two home occupation
Right.
tiers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
So you'll have two, so if you have in R1, if whatever it's called, this non-visual or whatever you're gonna call it,
Invisible.
it will show up as a permitted use, or the invisible one.
If we put
And the
down
other ones will
invisible
show up
home
as-
occupations, you know how long town meeting's
Yeah,
gonna
I
be.
know. But that's what you mean.
It'll be a two-dayer.
Give it to the name.
It'll be more than that.
We've had
yeah,
two
give
days
it another
before.
name, that's
Just give it
right.
another name.
Good.
Unless the ordinance is going to eliminate their table of definitions.
No, you need two definitions, substitute for that one. So you can list them on
Good luck
the
with that.
use tables.
I'm not sure
Wait a minute, I know where this is
that is necessary, because we're going to be putting the standards that apply to what.
Well, where you gonna put,
I
where you
agree
gonna
with
put home
Tom.
occupation on this list?
I agree with Tom. I think it's gotta be in the definitions.
Okay.
Home occupation 1, home occupation 2.
Yeah.
Home
Yeah.
occupation invisible,
Yeah.
home occupation very visible.
Invisible,
I-
visible,
I-
tell you.
Or indivisible. I
Yeah,
don't-
we could, 1, 2, A, B.
and we can find a synonym for invisible.
Yeah.
we probably can't.
Honestly,
I like that.
Non-
Non-invasive.
Non-invasive home occupation.
so we're
That'll
gonna
take
have
some
an
explaining
invasive
too.
That will take a lot of explaining. Bruce.
Now, Donna, when we do this, even for the home occupations that are invisible,
Discrete.
Oh,
Oh,
Nice.
that might be good,
that are
but
discrete,
that'll be unique.
would we still impose a 25% of the home?
yes.
probably, yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to be
Yeah.
sure.
Because it has to be understood that it is incidental, and if you start making it larger, it's going to become the main focus of that property. And I
So
don't
it's
think that's appropriate.
Is 25 the best number?
I think 25 depends, if, you end up looking at it. We have up to 1,000 square feet. So it's 25% or 1,000 square feet, whichever is greater.
Certainly for the discrete ones, I think you got it.
Where's, okay,
Well,
'cause this isn't.
The other part of that is, if it is a discrete home occupation, and therefore, as the homeowner, I'm the only one who knows about it. If I hit 26%, who's gonna know?
Well,
Nobody.
nobody.
No, but at the point where the house
If
is
you hit
now,
80%,
then it's no longer
and it's no
terribly
longer
dis-
a residence.
Exactly,
Right.
yeah, it's a self-defeating situation.
So
No,
we need a definition for home occupation discrete and a home occupation indiscreet.
Alright, well, the discrete home occupation, for lack of a better title,
Sure. We
is
may come up
one
with
that
something
does
better.
not impact the neighbors, it does not have that list
No
that we went
signs,
through
there's no
before.
employees.
You don't have a
Not
sign,
visible,
And then Jens has the list of what is an indiscreet, no, but one that is not, that's visible and impactful. And that is your list, which is the one you came up with, and that's noise, debris, odor,
We need to-
signs, employees,
Storage.
storage,
We need to put lighting on that list.
Lighting.
Lighting,
yeah,
and traffic is gotta be
Traffic,
specific, it's gotta be specific.
whatever.
well, we can fall
Traffic is
back,
relevant.
yeah.
It's-
Well, traffic implies that you have people coming to your home
Right.
for whatever purpose.
And there was a good definition I saw in one of these, says no more than one client per hour,
Right, so it's,
which wasn't bad, I kinda like that.
Yeah, that's,
Make 10 a day.
But I think, or else in this case, I mean, frankly speaking, when I had my home occupation as a landscape architect, I occasionally had a helper, I had an employee, but I never had people come to my house. I always went to my clients.
Yeah.
First of all, it was easier on me, second of all, I lived in Boatown, Gray, and who wants to go there? And it was just easier for me to go to the clients, plus I got the mileage. So, I didn't have a sign, nobody knew about it, and there was no traffic, there was zero traffic. The only traffic was me leaving and coming back.
but
But
if,
insurance salesman,
Insurance salesman, yeah, there's another one.
if you have this discrete,
Well,
Home
yeah, he'll come and
occupation.
go, yeah. Then,
you basically wouldn't have anybody coming to your house at all.
Right.
You're not selling a product from the house. At the point where you're selling the product or you're having a client come, even one per hour, then you qualify for a permit. Because now your neighbors know what you're doing. I guess that
how
to
about
me is,
Amazon deliveries?
so visitors
Well,
are defined differently than, if you are talking about
It's
traffic.
clients.
So traffic
clients.
has a certain meaning, and visitors, for instance, people coming and going from their house, visiting you and whatever, falls into a different category. So traffic would fall into this one and not into the discrete business.
Right.
Do we
So
have,
so it's client traffic
Yes.
or delivery
business-
traffic.
Business traffic,
Business.
right.
do we have any home occupation
Business
hairdressers in town that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of, which is surprising, because that's usually the bigger problem in most other communities, is personal services like hairdressing, podiatry, but, nails,
Dog
stuff.
owners.
But
Dog
they would,
owners are big too.
they would need permits.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
they're
they
not
would need a
discrete home
Right.
occupations.
Well,
Well,
you're
the-
going to their place of business in order to do business. And you can't cut out retail, because, we do have the gunsmith, for instance. He said, how many clients a day? Once a week, or twice a week, that's fine. But, you have to have limits on how many trips in one way or another. That make a separation between indiscreet and discreet.
Well, the reason I asked is with a hairdresser, they would not be able to support themselves in an hour.
No, they couldn't.
But then
Unless
they
it's
get a permit.
Right, but I think he was saying even under the permitted ones, there would be a limit on how many trips a day.
Well, you think about it, how many right now we have 40 trips per day, business related.
That's a lot.
That's
That's
a
a
lot
lot.
of trips.
Right, but you just said something about limiting to one an hour.
Yeah, that was just throwing that out,
Oh.
that was one I had seen, that's not ours right now, that's one I had, that was in one of
In one of the
the
towns.
ordinances that
The
Susan.
issue that we would have at that point, and I'm just gonna pick on hairdressers, and I have no idea how long it takes to do somebody's hair.
Depends on what you're doing.
But I would think that an hour would, I know from an accounting point of view, an hour is more like one every 2 hours.
Right.
You know, so I don't know if an hour from a hairdressing point of view is unreasonable.
Yeah,
Well, sometimes you can do multiple clients at the same time.
Yeah.
So beauty takes a lot of time.
Beauty's only skin,
It
or
does.
in the eye of the beholder. It's one of those two, and I haven't figured out which one.
If I go in to have my hair done,
Yeah, cool, she wanna.
and Donna goes in to have her hair done, two totally different times. But
I don't know if
I
I
mean,
would go down.
one of my best friends is a hairdresser, and
I have no idea.
you know,
Well, anyway,
they can have
so-
people coming in depending on what they're doing, you know, whether it's just a cut for a guy or a trim. They could see somebody every
Or
15 minutes.
coloration or.
Well,
Yeah, but
That's-
you, that person would get,
So we can-
then you would have a
we can
permit.
look at that.
Right.
Because that's
Right.
not a discrete
No, I just
unit,
asked
so
about
you-
it because he said about limiting it to
Oh.
an hour, and I'm like,
I think they were thinking of psychiatrists and psychologists.
They were thinking about that kind of profession.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because there was at one point a dentist a young dentist came to us and said, well, I wanna set up a dental office in my home. And I said, sure, terrific, great. Jim was going apoplectic about it, saying, that's just gonna be too much of an impact. And I said, well, it's not gonna be 40 trips. I said, you don't know that. She's gonna have cleaners, she's gonna have a hygienist, so she's gonna be doing cleanings, have to be female dentist. And she'll probably have 2 assistants doing this, and he started going on and on about this, and he said, I just think that's way too much of an impact in this neighborhood, and we're gonna get complaints on it.
yeah, with two in the dentist, you would have been over your space.
Probably would have been over 40,
You would have been over, no, you would have been over your space.
Probably.
Yeah.
big house.
You would have been, it doesn't matter. Remember you said there was a limit of 25% or 1,000.
Right, yeah.
Whichever is smaller.
No, I thought it was, it's smaller or greater?
Up
Smaller.
to.
Up to 8,000.
Yeah, well, Donna's right,
Yeah.
yeah, up to whatever, so,
Right.
1,000 feet.
May not exceed 1,000 square feet, whichever is smaller, 25%.
Yeah, and you think 1,000 square feet is a
It's
lot
not much.
It's no,
Yeah.
it's not.
until you square it off.
Right.
Because dental things have to be, because they do radiology, they do all kinds of, they have to be certain sizes and.
Well, so they
But
get-
think about a
Okay,
GP's office,
but-
I mean, and I'm throwing these things out just to get an idea from everybody, you know, what they consider to be tolerable. And really, cause my own primary physician when I was growing up, he had a farm and it was in a
Yeah, I
little
think a
house in
lot
the
of us
back and one
had
one
that
assistant and
experience.
he was the
No,
doctor, he was
no.
the fire department doctor, it was a country doctor thing, come to your house if you were sick at night, and you never knew that Dr. Hansel was there, you never knew.
And if we could find him and bring him to Arundel.
Yeah, we
He's not doing very well
Plug
right
him.
now.
Yeah, and I hate to say it, but times have changed when
Yes,
it
they
comes to
have.
that.
Yeah,
You
that's,
know,
that's an old paradigm, I know.
I can live with the dentists, I can live with some doctors, but some of the other medical professions, bring in, let's just say, bring in clients that I don't think we
You may
want
not
in
want the
residential
residential area.
areas.
And do we have limits on hours of operation?
There are none in here.
There should be,
Well,
don't you
there should
think?
be if there's
We can-
involving
we can
traffic,
go-
yes,
We can go
or
through it.
persons going there. And the question is, how many persons do we want? I mean, that's gonna be a big issue.
Well, but for instance, I have a direct neighbor that he supposedly bills cabinetry, morning, noon, and night, 7 days a week. So is there a quiet period? Is Sundays a day that you're not supposed to have work done on your property, or
Can you hear it? Is it
Oh,
a noise
every-
violation?
every day?
Really?
You know, probably, but, you know. But I'm just saying that it might be worthwhile putting in some kind of
But we can.
definition of hours of operation.
Oh,
It's
yeah, and
like,
I think that would, sad to say, I think a lot of that depends upon the zone that you are in. We're talking R1, which is supposed to be a densely urbanized area, according to the comp plan. So we probably would wanna restrict hours of operation. But if you're in a different zone, if you're in R3 or R4, maybe not so much.
well, so we have somebody before us on the planning board who, they can't do something more than every 15 minutes and so many times during the day, but it doesn't say that he's restricted from doing it in the middle of the night at 3 o'clock in the morning, as long as he doesn't exceed
The 15 minute.
that 15-minute limit. And I think that we should probably define that a little bit better, so that somebody doesn't
And
take
again,
advantage of it.
that is something, in this case, it's a conditional use permit, so we can put that condition on there.
It's just that, so that it might be another thing to
It
add.
seems to me that that would be something that you have to gauge according to what the actual activity was.
Hmm.
I mean, you know, there were some things that you could do in the middle of the night very quietly, your neighbors would never know. But, you know, if you're building and testing jackhammers, that's
Right, or
probably.
running your trucks or whatever.
Right.
This one didn't fall into the discrete category.
So, I mean, once you get to that permit stage, then yeah, you can finesse those depending upon the activity.
And is it a home occupation or is it a business?
Well,
That's not.
It's-
it's in his home, but he's running his business. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and, well, the irony is that activity was approved as a home occupation.
You grew into a contract to storage yard.
We can,
Which is what happened.
we can get the IT guy who's gonna be a lot like me when I start working on my computer and it doesn't work. You're gonna get breaking glass. 'cause they
We
threw
have a
everything
pretty
in.
good list going, I think.
But not every night.
We do.
No,
So
I
expensive.
have to get the guy to come in and replace the windows so that I can throw something the next day.
Thank you for obfuscating this issue.
No, I think we've got some very good material to work with, and we've reached a decision in terms of how we're gonna do that. Now, we as a planning board have to work up all the details and what it's gonna look like.
You've got multiple examples, that's for
And
sure.
we do, we've got a lot of good information that we can work with and go forward from.
Well, do you want me to try to flesh this out for the next meeting, so we can put this one to bed? I mean, here's the irony, we just dealt with a conditional use that spans many districts. We're supposed to focus on the R1.
But that's okay,
That's okay, cause it's a
because then
problem.
you're done for the next ones.
It's a
We don't have
problem
to
that deals with
reinvent the wheel.
2 and 3.
Yes.
And, there's a 3, and then rural's gonna be different. We might have 3. Or we might not, I don't know, it all depends. I think we're into a different animal when we get into the rural conservation district.
But that's part of being adaptable.
Yeah.
And so you'll see. So if you need 3, you'll create a 3rd category. And, you know, maybe down the road in 10 years, a 4th. I mean, who knows?
I suspect though that if the distinctive features between discrete and indiscrete are sufficiently broad, like, you know, sign, no sign, that's easy, then it won't matter what district you're in. Because regardless of the proximity of the neighbor's house, if you're creating enough noise to mess with your neighbors, or you have enough traffic on your road, even if it's a rural road, you're still increasing the traffic past a certain point, you're still gonna fall into those same categories.
So the bottom line is maintaining the character of
Let's
the
define,
area.
well, let's define the
And that's
character.
gonna be a tough one.
Well, but
Yeah.
so
Define
by
what
not
character is.
having the sign and not having a lot of these things, you know,
Those are things I
Those
can hang
will
my hat
be
on.
permitted.
Character is always a relative and amorphous.
well, I think we can find a synonym for character.
I think what you have to do is be careful when you're writing your rules to consider the town we live in.
Yeah.
Not what other towns have done, but what do we have issues with now that we might wanna bring them in a little bit, but just be careful not to go too far.
And do we have a size of a sign?
8
Yes.
square feet, I believe is what we said.
Yep.
Yeah, 8 square feet.
2x4. It's not a small sign.
Yeah.
It's 2x4. Think of it that way.
If you have a home occupation, it shouldn't need anything.
And can it be lit?
No,
Okay, I'm just asking, you know, all the stupid questions.
No, those are all legitimate questions, and actually, it's gone up, it used to be 4 square feet, so it's doubled. So it was a 2x2 sign before, and now it's gone to 4x8.
I think by controlling the things such as, you know, size of sign, not illuminated, noise, traffic, et cetera, you are preserving whatever the character is right there.
I agree,
So I think that solves itself as we go along, and
I agree with that too.
people who have signs who have no impact whatsoever. And I'll use her name, Maureen, Virgie, she's got a real estate sign, it's like this big,
Yeah, it's not very big.
it's about that big.
About
No
one
impact,
square
she
foot.
doesn't, she uses her telephone and her computer. So,
Yeah.
so. We'll have to think about
Yeah.
signs. Maybe we'll have to think about size of signs.
Because that really does fall into the first category, but she does have a sign.
She does have signs.
So, that's true. So maybe in that first category, we could allow a small,
Smaller sign?
Discreet.
Small sign.
a discrete sign to
That's
show a
right.
discrete home
That's right.
occupation.
I like that, how
Because
this
hers
is
is
coming
definitely
together.
But-
a discreet
Yeah, like
application.
Notary Public, for example.
Exactly, that's.
Right,
another-
I totally
that's another
agree.
one.
And how about don't eat your lunch on my road, private? Every weekend, I have people having lunch on my road. They drive up towards my house, they get out, they walk around, they get back in their car, and they eat their lunch.
Oh, my goodness.
It's
Are
Apparently-
you serving anything?
Apparently,
nothing.
apparently there's no understanding of what private means.
No, I'm
no,
putting
okay.
a discreet sign outside my house that says,
Well, you're allowed to do that just as a property
right, I'm
owner.
going to.
Yes.
So you're much nicer than I am. Way nicer than me.
She'll learn that.
Yeah,
Right,
after the
I don't
first
know
time of
about her or
having a
anything
meeting
like
lunch,
that
I'd
right
be
now,
going,
but time will tell.
excuse me, do you know what private road means? No.
I don't even
Please.
say road, on my sign, it's not gonna say road, it's just gonna say private,
Maybe
no lunch.
picnic table and donation box.
Right.
Say
Donation.
mandatory or
Yeah.
suggested donation.
Yeah. Don't let the sign hit you on the
Oh,
way
I
out.
don't know how to tell you this, but up at our camp, we had a big metal gate that just said private on it too, because we didn't wanna be offensive and say no trespassing. And the ATVers blew the whole gate up.
Oh, you should see mine. And it's not the ATVs that did it, it's the trucks. They cut down trees on my property, they made roads through my property. And the answer from other people that I called was, oh, get pictures of them.
You should have said Cole sighting in his gun.
That's right.
Oh, I went out there, I was all dressed up, I went out there, I caught one of them in his truck and I made him back, all the way back out. I go, no, you go right out, the same way you came in, go.
I don't recommend my process. When I first bought my house in Sanford, we had a huge hill on the back side that was not mine, it was the town's. And three-wheelers would come up over the top. And I went at 11 o'clock at night. And I take a flashlight on with a shotgun, and I went out there one day and I said, the next time you come over this hill, you're gonna have to call the ambulance, cause your three-wheeler's gonna get shot.
Oh,
They
yeah,
never
they'd be
came
out
back
at
up over the hill.
1:30 in the morning, they would be out there with their ripping.
Yep.
I have like roads through my property.
So you
I
just,
went out, put sticks like everywhere, and I go 2 days later and they're like all moved on. I went back, put them all back, put bigger sticks.
So you might need more than a sign.
Right.
Yeah,
borrow the one.
Time will tell.
and I will report back.
Do you wanna continue
Can you
going
believe
down
that?
the list of
Sunday.
proposed and
No.
conditional uses that we never
How
finished?
much spikes?
Well, we're all
Yeah,
set.
spikes for that, we thought
We've
about
got
that.
a few minutes.
I think we got a lot of progress.
Individual private campsite? Yeah. Really?
That's John, Jamie.
It's a permitted use, an individual private campsite. Like I'm gonna tell somebody they can't have a campsite on their property to start with.
Like you're gonna know.
Did you see
Oh,
the,
have
did
you
you,
ever seen Jim's
Did you-
place? He's got a camper
Are
out
you talking
there.
about Senate Row?
Yeah,
Oh,
we
yeah.
see them all the time,
Yeah.
every summer.
The porta potty?
Yeah, he's got his own porta potty, he's got
Yeah.
a camping.
I love the
He
art.
doesn't need a porta potty, cause he also has a holding tank there.
Ah.
And, he's got Chinese lanterns and everything.
oh yeah, there's a company that sent me something that wants to put one on my property.
A porta potty?
No, I can't, they do individual like tents and little things on platforms and they rent them out for you and you get part of the money.
His kid almost got killed on our property one
Really?
time. Yeah,
Yeah.
he hit a
Take the
fish hook.
pole out.
Oh, was it a pole?
Yeah.
and
take the
we-
pole out.
You know, put the light on, he goes, I'm okay, he totaled his car on our property.
I didn't hear that one.
Oh, yeah,
Was that
that-
the summer?
No, it was a couple of years ago.
Oh, okay, that's,
It was-
all right.
No, it wasn't last summer, it was more, it was 2 years back
Kid.
at least,
Going too fast.
yeah.
Yeah.
He almost bought it, he was like 2 foot from really buying it on a big tree. And then he came across and got the pole,
Yeah, you
the
can,
pole went over his car,
and he, nope.
Wow,
and he's lucky he didn't get hurt.
okay, wow.
So,
Anyway.
All right,
is it
individual
just me,
campsite.
individual private campsites, really?
What
I guess
which list are we reading from here?
That's the, no,
Permitted,
no, that's this
permitted
list.
conditional uses for,
Oh, okay.
Do you know why that's in there? It's in there, part of the reason is because it's part of the, it's actually one of the uses that's specified in the shoreline zoning ordinance. As most of these are, quite frankly. And also because, the IBC does not recognize tents as a structure. So,
oh, good,
Yeah,
Well,
the
they don't
advertisement
allow
that I got
it.
was a tent on it, it's like on a
who
platform.
cares?
Just like in Girl Scouts.
Yeah, I would tell you.
Yeah, I don't have a problem leaving it there, I just thought it was very strange that we can.
It comes from,
have
a lot of these, we had to put it in because they had been listed. If you remember, the deal in making the format change was not to change anything that was in the chart. So this was the chart that was translated into list. And because when we did the shoreline zoning, we had to include all the uses that the state wants in the shoreline zoning, codified or listed, we put them in here. Frankly speaking, I'd like to see most of this stuff gone, and just put in uses allowed in shoreline zones.
Yeah, like that where it says number 20.
And we have shoreline zones which have these uses in it, so it's kinda like, why is this here?
Well, then why don't we take them out?
I would like to get rid of a lot
I
of this
agree.
stuff, to be honest
Yeah,
with you, because
just do that.
it's a huge list of useless information.
Right, so put down the ones that are gonna matter to people, and then put in your phrase, refer them to wherever that
Shoreline
is.
zones, and then we have our own it's section 8, and it has all
And-
these uses in there.
Perfect, section 8, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, it is.
A marina.
That wasn't
For the,
accidental, by the
for the
way.
insane.
A marina in R1?
That's the short answer.
That's a shoreline
Yeah.
zone, 'cause we do have
That's
a
why you
river,
have-
that's.
Well, I can
Piers and
see
wharves.
the individual private campsite, but marinas?
Yeah, no, I can't
No.
see Maria.
Piers and
So,
docks.
so
Well, you
which,
do have the
it's-
river there,
No,
you do have the river.
which ones on this list qualify for
Causeway.
removal because of shoreline zoning?
Let's see.
And we already know it's individual private campsite.
Yeah.
And it's
but
Maria.
I would leave that one, I don't think
Fire
that bothers
protection
me.
activities, forest management activities, except for timber harvesting. Land management roads. I don't see a lot of marina potential here.
Especially in the R1.
Motorized vehicle traffic on existing roads and trails, that's pretty idiotic.
Thank you.
Non-intensive recreational use not requiring structures such as hunting, fishing, and hiking. See, I could see that going, bye-bye. Okay, residential, there we go, that's a good one. Soil and
That's a
water
keeper.
conservation practices, that can go.
Pier dock.
Pier dock, actually, there's a portion of the R1,
It's only one little tiny corner.
and it's just that corner down there. Oh, you got the map, good.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right, so we keep 17?
But that's, actually, you know what, that's a subdivision, that's, what is that, that's, Clearwater?
It's Clearview Estates.
Clearview Estates, right?
Right.
Yeah, so there's not gonna be any marina there.
Well, no, the water, yeah, but.
No, it's not
Let's
a
look at
marina,
pier
it's a
dock.
Look at a
pier
pier,
dock.
look at a pier. It's
But it's
any water
temporary
body.
in nature.
It's a water body. See, it says projecting a water body, it's not even, a river doesn't even qualify for water.
So if
That's-
there's
that's
water
not
in
a-
it, I
that's not
would
a-
leave
You
it.
could,
Yeah.
you could walk over that. That's that, what's the name of that brook?
That's Duck Brook, yeah, that is Duck Brook. It's not so
No,
small.
Duck Brook doesn't go that far.
Yeah, it
Go
does.
that way.
Yeah, it does.
Duck Brook
Yeah.
crosses Limerick Road. We're,
You
we're
could-
that,
But it
You
winds
could-
around
you
behind
could-
you.
yeah, I know it goes behind me, but I don't come anyplace.
That's
close.
only one tributary.
Yeah, so you
One
could jump over
tributary.
it.
Several tributaries.
You couldn't do it behind my house, cause it's 30 feet down.
Okay, well, we can get rid of
You
piers.
put it-
Yeah,
Alright, so
piers.
we're
Let's get rid of
eliminating
piers.
17.
All that 17 out, right?
Public facility we kinda need in there. Timber harvesting less than 40% basal area, that we already have, that's not related to shoreline zoning, that's related to timber harvesting. Wildlife management practices can go. Gee,
And
it
you
just got smaller.
So
Yard
we've
sale is
eliminated
permitted.
7, 8, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 16, 17, and 20.
Yep.
So we got rid of 8? I mean, we got rid of the individual campsites?
No, we got rid of
No.
forest management.
Oh,
Forest management, I'll go over them once again.
Yes.
Actually, I think maybe clearing for removal of vegetation for activities other than material, yeah. Somehow we
You
gotta
need
get
a
in there.
permit to clear your property?
No,
Oh, yeah.
it's a permitted use.
Tremendous.
This is permitted
Oh,
use to do.
I would leave that.
But if you're doing, if you're clear cutting, if you're doing forestry, if you're doing timber harvesting, for the purpose of selling off the timber, not associated with another activity, you need a permit. 40% you need a bill, you need
But
a.
that's not what this
But
says.
it says other than
This
timber
is
Other than-
clearing
harvesting.
for removal of vegetation for activities
Other than timber harvesting.
Get it out of there.
Okay, so, from the top. From the top,
Yeah. You want what's in there or what's not in there?
It-
Let's go
It's
what's
just-
not
What we're
in
taking
there.
out.
what are
we're
we taking out?
Yeah, number 5, number 7, number 8, number 11, number 12, number 13, number 14, number 16, number 17, and number 20.
Now, can I ask you something, since this section, since this area does have a section, you probably wouldn't have a wharf or some of that kind of stuff, but what if they do have a dock?
Yeah, I was thinking
But that's,
about that.
What-
This
what's-
isn't
that's allowed
close enough.
in the shoreline
Yeah.
overlay.
That's,
So you would look at it and say, in the shoreline overlay, you can have
Would
it.
that fall into the shoreland overlay?
Only if it's in a shoreline overlay district.
Yeah, see,
That's the issue, come to think of it. If you have a pond, here's a good example. Schwecker property, small pond down there, let's say they wanna put a dock in there. It's not a shoreline zone, so we're not gonna regulate it there. Can you
but
put
it's
a-
not a permanent use if you take it out.
Yeah, but what if you wanted to keep it in? What if you wanna just put a dock in for the kids to fish off?
If you wanna keep it in, it's a conditional use. In this,
We haven't
This-
we haven't limited.
You wanna keep it in or you wanna add it? It's,
no, cause we have it broken down under permitted uses, it's temporary, and permanent, it's a conditional use.
There aren't any significant enough water bodies to be agitating with this.
Yeah, I know, the only thing I was thinking about was just having making it alright, let's make it a conditional use just for the heck of it. Because it's in it, the only time I was just brought you up one was Schwecker's, there's another pond that's across, that's right by Bert Calgill's place, that actually, what's the name of that pond? It has no name,
It has no
it's
name.
got a hydrant in it, it's got a broken hydrant in it.
Yeah.
On Limerick Road,
Yeah,
yeah.
you know the one I'm talking
Yep.
about.
Yep.
I can't think of any other ponds until you get to Duck Brook.
Right off of Senate Road, there's a body of
It's a
water.
hydrant.
Well,
there's
you
one-
have, well,
there's
you
one
have
back-
the
there's
one
one
on
back
Limerick
down
Road,
this way.
almost by where you turn off to go to Bentley's. There's a pond in the front of that house.
Well, there's a separate pond, there's a fire pond.
Oh, that's
all the way
Phil's.
back down
Yeah.
here.
Phil's pond.
that's the Labbies, right?
Yeah, that's the last
Yeah.
pond.
But if you go past him, there's one further down.
Yeah.
And I
But that's
don't
a
know.
It's
fire
right next
pond,
to
I think,
Bert,
in
that's,
front of the
yeah,
Labbies.
but if you wanted to put a dock in
No,
there,
that-
so I think we need to say that you wanna make sure that we don't exclude it. I know it
Yeah,
sounds
yeah.
stupid.
alright, so we're
Well,
gonna,
we'll
we're
just
gonna
leave
leave
it.
17 in,
Well, no, I
How
just
about
say
just
change
leave
it to
dock
leave
in?
dock in.
Dock, just dock.
alright,
Yeah, take out the pier, wharf, causeway,
Yeah, Causeway is.
and just say
Causeway
a
doesn't
dock
fit.
projecting
No.
into a
You're not
water
gonna be
body.
building
It's
a
temporary.
pier.
Right.
why not just say dock, temporary,
How about, and then we'll make dock permanent.
and dock permit down and,
Sounds good.
Yep.
just think of all the words we have eliminated.
Oh, we've got the line in there, so let's use it all. So dock is in there. Well, how about pier or dock? Cause a pier is not the same as a dock. Dock is free, a dock is out, it's free floating, there's no connection.
Who's gonna put a pier in a pond? I'm just
Yeah,
curious.
You could put a dock in a pond.
Oh, yeah, you could put a dock in a pond.
All right, so what do you call that thing where you put it on the edge of the property and
If
you
somebody
bring it
wants
out
to
into
do
the
it,
water?
let them do it.
Right, that's what I pretty much, yeah,
So what do you?
So we're putting pier back in?
yeah, pure dock. How about
You know,
just
in all
pure
the
dock?
Dickens novels, there was always a circle.
So the pier is if
locution
it comes out
office.
from the property.
Which
It
had
goes from
stairway
dry
that
land
went-
projecting into water.
All right.
Okay?
I think it was John Dice and John Dice was one of his famous stories.
So and we would do the same thing down below.
Okay.
Okay, so that's.
What if we wanna
that
put a
makes-
dance hall at the end of the pier?
Then you have
Good old
orchard.
orchard.
Thank you.
Or for that matter, I
That
used
was
to be
still
in
there
Hampton.
when I was a teenager.
You know, as a
Oh, yeah.
conditional use, you know, every town has, a mention of a sex businesses.
Yeah, we don't have those.
We don't have those.
No, we
That's
don't.
right.
But
You
we
don't have
don't
any
need to
under our
put
ordinance
brothel
if
on
it's
this
not-
list.
Under the ordinance, if it's not allowed, it's prohibited.
It's more general than that, but it's every single town. I thought that was really interesting.
Well, it's, and part of the reason, and that's actually on our planning board list to do a conditional use on, because I think you have to allow for it. There was a
That I
time,
don't know,
there
but
was a time that you had to allow for it.
they,
So-
every single one of these towns that I looked at, they all have an
Yeah.
ordinance for
Right.
Because I
business
think
I
it was
that
all-
say
involves
Yeah,
until
sex.
Tom
somebody
can tell us
tells
better
us we have
than,
to,
these two gentlemen
don't.
can tell us, but I thought there was a law court case on it.
I think we should have it
Right, First Amendment, right?
in the
I think it is, Tom.
BI.
I think that's it.
We don't have
All
it.
right, expression.
I just thought,
Yeah.
yeah,
That's why it's there. Oh, that's why it's
every
finding it
single
allowed.
town,
Right.
including Los Angeles.
Well, that's a-
So-
Well, that's a surprise.
or what's left of Los Angeles.
Originator of the Me Too movement.
Yeah, we probably should have that.
We'll get around to that one of these days.
Yeah.
We have to, and we
It's
really
on our
do,
bucket.
because it is a civil.
Yes.
Cause you know sooner or later somebody's gonna insist on
Right.
it.
And they'll
Oh,
put
yeah.
it right,
Rugby
they'll put it
is-
right next to the new town
Bring
hall.
I have a perfect location to that. It goes in the BI with a 250-foot setback and must be buffered 100 feet in all directions from any of the neighbors.
Including
Well, that's
murder
how most- That's how most towns do it. They do 1,000 feet from a school, you know, a church, a public facility, a sidewalk, or a road.
Or anybody with a dog.
Oh, that too.
There you
Everybody
go.
who's got
No place you
got
can put it.
eyes.
Or right-handed, so,
Exactly. That's the kind of, it's a Buffalo clause.
Uh,
Okay, but we'll deal with that later.
perfect.
So let's look at the conditional uses then.
So this uses to permitted uses, we haven't had this issue, we haven't had any issue with keeping that clause, or is that something that you have to keep in there?
well, we need that in case something's been overlooked. that
Okay.
Somebody comes in and says, I
Right,
wanna
which
do
is
this.
similar to.
Right.
I don't know if that's, how that flies, but.
You know,
It's a
like the bank
dangerous
next to me.
Well,
it's a
has
dangerous-
it been a problem yet?
Nobody's asking to be.
Well,
Where they get robbed
Yeah,
and
but you
then
can
they're
qualify it.
scooting through my neighborhood.
Yeah, and this also opens up, I mean, you know, the next big question, I mean, I think we answered it before, so why not go over it again? Is the issue of, is there any other non-residential use that's appropriate in a high-density residential district? Permitted use.
nothing we
Since
can
it's
think
a
of tonight,
residential,
but,
no. But give some thought if there's anything else that's appropriate in that area.
I do wanna just make sure, cause it's been months since we did this, we did, at our first meeting, combine number 1 and 2. So it says accessory structure / use,
Yes.
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, I didn't make that change yet. We'll get that out of there.
And down to the conditional uses.
Yeah, when we get to the first one's a nice problem child.
Animal husbandry of 5 or less animal units.
Delete,
We can't,
why?
because we did not make the change at town meeting. Animal units is the unit of measurement
But
that
it
we
doesn't
have.
need to say that here, does it?
We could say animal husbandry and leave it blank,
Well, then you go to animal husbandry and whatever,
There's, right.
but
whatever it says is what it currently is.
And it's based on animal units.
but it's based on animal units. My point here in the R1 is that we have to say 5.
I think that's true.
Otherwise, we're What do you say to the guy who wants to put in 50?
45 too many.
Pretty much. So I think we leave the 5 in there, in the R1.
Okay, but that will change once the
Animal husbandry.
animal husbandry is finally properly addressed.
If we can
We
ever.
really, and, you know, I think we're gonna have to attack that, because that's gonna be a universal issue
Right.
throughout all the districts.
But I think for right now, we just leave it.
Okay.
We leave it for the moment.
Until we can manage to change the other section, this one's gonna have to stay,
Yeah. Cause it's pretty much what everybody's.
despite we don't like it.
No, we hate it, I mean, because we know you can have 4 horses, 4 cows, or
50,000 chickens.
50,000 chickens,
And that is the problem.
So USDA still wants to use animal, so I was just talking to them the other day, they said, oh, we like that better.
Well,
Impractical.
So we look
Yeah,
at
well, I've said that.
bed and breakfast at boarding house.
Yeah, boarding house said really hard.
I have a hard time, bed and breakfast, I don't have a hard time with. Boarding house is so commercial.
Well, it's also a dumping ground, it's now in this area. Boarding houses have changed, boarding houses now is a dumping ground for seasonal help.
So,
In the, over in Kennebunkport, to be honest, Kennebunkport.
what about Airbnbs kind of things? Should
I don't
we
wanna
have some
touch that.
mention?
No,
Well, a lot of the towns are having, because it's cutting into the
We don't have any
business,
hotels for it to
legitimate,
cut into.
well, we have so many
We
bed
have
and
no
break-
motels.
Well,
so
that's true,
we're-
don't we have some bed and
That's true.
breakfast?
No.
No,
Not yet.
no, not yet.
We might have one coming up, but not right now.
Okay, well, so it's not an issue for Arundel,
But I'd like to take boarding house out completely.
yeah.
No, and I think the
But Ralph
issue with the
wants that.
Airbnbs is that they don't like that it's taking
That's
away
where we
rental
could put the
property.
sex trade.
That's right.
For me, I would have voted for it because I wouldn't want the kids, cause there's no kids with an Airbnb.
That's right.
You
But
don't
there's
have
a
to,
lot of transient traffic that you don't get to control, so you really don't know who's coming in and going out of the
Oh, you
neighborhood.
know.
And we really don't,
You actually do.
they
No,
do
you
background
really-
checks
you-
and everything.
A
I
lot
love
of
it.
times you don't.
I run one in Massachusetts.
we don't know who's doing
But you're probably a
Airbnb
good guy
or
about it.
VRBO or any of the other
I'm an
rental possibilities.
absolute witch on it. I scream
You're
at
not,
it.
and personally, I don't wanna be saying to some homeowner, yeah, you've got a spare bedroom, no, you can't rent it out.
But that's not really a boarding house.
No, boarding house is, as it says, it's essentially you rent out rooms and you provide room and board on a room by room basis. The difference between that and a bed and breakfast is that bed and breakfast, you only serve breakfast. believe it or not.
One of the things that, do we have non-allowed uses?
You know, I tried doing that. People, no, we don't. If you have similar uses, similar to conditional uses, and you invite, you may wanna change that. But
Well, what I'm saying is.
if it's not listed, it's not permitted, is what it boils down to.
Okay, so if it's not listed, it's not permitted.
Correct.
Okay, because one of the things I would have said is you wanna make sure that you don't allow sober homes anywhere in any zone.
Yeah, that's
That's
where it
wrong.
gets a little dicey, cause that's community living arrangements, and we've already
No,
had
it's not.
a community living arrangement, it is?
No, these are sober homes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Halfway houses.
Yeah, take a look at the issues that they're having in California and Florida, where they're going into all the residential areas and
I
buying the
told
houses.
you, we had that multi-million-dollar houses. They had a halfway house. And it was a real issue, and the neighborhoods found very creative ways to stop them from the residences.
And we would have to come up with a creative way, because honestly, frankly speaking, we had this big issue, I think we had this issue back in the nineties. Portland had a huge problem with it, and they prohibited it, and I believe DHS stepped in, and the legislature changed it, so you cannot rent halfway houses from going in residential neighborhoods.
No, this is not a halfway house. They actually call them sober homes.
Okay, these are-
Soccer would know something about that.
Yep, Saco has a couple of them.
And I will make a couple of telephone calls to the left coast, just to see what they came up with. I think numbers 22 and 14, we should say uses similar to uses similar to permitted uses upon approval. So in other words,
So they have to come in.
they have to come
What's
and
in
you
it?
have to bless,
It's implied, I think.
Yeah, it
Well-
is. Because the code, and that sits on the code enforcement, officer's shoulders, and he always says, I don't want it.
You don't wanna say upon approval?
No, he doesn't want it, he doesn't want 22 or 14. He says, I don't wanna make that call.
How about a park?
You know, we have
Recreational
recreational
facility.
facility.
Well,
Parks and
why couldn't
Recreation.
you change it to say uses similar to permitted uses upon application to the planning board?
Because I have to do it anyway, don't they?
No,
Not to the planning board, it's to the code officer who wants the call.
the conditional use they have to do to the planning board.
Jimmy's gotta make the call. Simple as that.
Before we leave that, could we at least agree on whether we're gonna capitalize all those words or not?
Yes.
Capitalize what's all.
Similar and permitted.
Yeah, in 22 they're capitalized, in 14 they're not.
Oh,
I
for
think-
They
goodness
should not be
sakes.
capitalized.
They're
I
not
didn't think
supposed to
so.
be capitalized, it's improper English.
Oh,
Not only that,
I
it's
didn't
just
think
wrong.
similar was a noun.
Well, you never met her, did you?
No, I did not.
No, she was a lot like your sister.
Okay.
We'll be here all week.
Okay. So,
Just correct it.
I wanna go back.
It's corrected, okay?
Are we going to take boarding house out, or are we going to leave?
I think we should leave it in because I could make the argument that that's a similar conditional use to a bed and breakfast.
Well, let's look at the definition, because
Is it not?
No, I don't think it is.
I'll tell you why I'm a little concerned about it, because what they've been doing, let's say in Old Orchard they did it, and what else they've been doing, they've been taking boarding houses and stuffing all the summer helpers from Lithuania or
Didn't
Russia.
the boat school do that too?
Yeah, they did it too.
I think they might still do it, don't they?
They have a dorm,
Houses in
they
Cape
call
Columbus
theirs
that
a
did it,
dorm.
Yeah.
Too.
They have a dorm, it was a dorm in the
It's
back
a
of the
dorm in the
green.
back of the
There's
bicycle.
lodging
Right.
and or meals are provided
Yeah,
for a
You know who
period of
does
at
that?
least
We
1
know
week.
somebody who does that.
For compensation and all.
The guy who built my house does it
oh, yeah.
all over the place.
Well,
But I
I
think
don't
what
see-
differentiates it from a bed and breakfast, it says for compensation.
Is bed and breakfast is what is single-family dwelling in which lodging or lodging and breakfast are offered. And there are no more than 3 bedrooms for lodging purposes. That's, so you've restricted it right there.
Oh, I think that's dumb. You can't have bed and breakfast.
No, I was gonna say the same thing. Like, I don't know how anybody could keep a bed and breakfast going with 3, that's probably why the one on,
But the-
one closed.
I think the primary difference is bed and breakfast is a single-family dwelling, a boarding house is any residential structure.
Yeah, usually it's a multi.
So you don't even have to be there.
Well, no, in
Yeah,
this
you do.
ordinance you do,
Yeah,
we
you-
require the owner to live on premises.
And that's what's kept, several facilities in the town from becoming boarding houses or dumping grounds for, or, you know, they're boarding
Because they
houses
live
for
there.
help, for
Because
summer
I
help,
live there.
because you have to live there, and nobody wants to do that. And the
Okay,
question
so-
is, do you want that? We don't have lodging in here, you know, incidentally, which.
It's the R1, it's
I was just gonna say, I'm
residential.
inclined to think it doesn't belong in
It
R
doesn't
one.
belong there.
Might belong in might belong someplace else, but not,
I can see putting a bed and breakfast in the R1, because it's a very transitory, you know, you're gonna show up and you're gonna have breakfast and you're gonna go away.
Well,
actually, I'm not even sure I like that in R one, to be honest with you.
And the argument could be made to take it up, but I can see that better than I can see a boarding house.
Yes.
And I could, you know, let's look at the Schwecker property, that might be a good bed and breakfast right there,
Yeah.
Yeah.
that house. I've talked to the owners, by the way, they're not gonna do that, but somewhere down the line.
That the one on Limerick,
Yeah.
Yeah, closed,
the
right?
big farm?
No, that place has never been closed up, they use it in the summer, the Schwecker family has used it in the oh, they closed.
They
Yeah,
closed,
on
they
the property.
closed the transaction.
Yeah, the folks are from Texas. They wanna cook cattle. A little bit.
So what are
No
we
Texas
gonna,
Longhorns.
what are we gonna do about churches, parish houses and whatever? So, the area where I lived at one point in time in Los Angeles had a big issue with churches being established in residences. Not traditional churches as we know them, but all kinds of religious groups,
Home churches?
home churches, and it became a huge nuisance.
A lot of people do, get away from the taxes. What's the definition of the church? Is there, do we have a?
Parish
It's a house of
houses,
worship.
parish house is one thing, but church is another. And is there,
Building used by an organization to hold regularly attended religious services.
it was a really slippery slope, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court to
Well,
stop them from
You
having
guys have
it.
mega churches, that's your problem.
No, this was small, but it was
These were
cultish.
home Bible studies.
Oh, they're home Bibles?
It was
I
like
wouldn't
a
wanna touch that.
cult,
Well, it depends on the cults, but
right.
it was used to shut down home Bible studies as well.
Yeah,
Yeah, you got 10 or 12 people getting together to have a Bible study in a house, and they were saying it's a church. You can't do it.
Well, it was a big Scientology issue, there were issues all, not that we're gonna have that, I'm just saying,
Oh, no, I
but
understand
it
that.
can be a real nuisance.
It can be.
That's-
Well, that's why it's a conditional
That's why
use.
it's a conditional
Yeah,
use.
so, I don't,
And honestly, even from a conditional use, what are we gonna do? Tell the Scientologists that they can't have one, and we're gonna allow the Baptists? We're gonna create a problem there.
well, it depends on, the issue that arose in the situation that I'm talking about. They took a residence and turned it into a church in an R1 area where it was strictly residential.
Oh, we're gonna run
And-
smack into the building codes there.
So
Yeah.
that was not permitted,
Yeah.
but they did it anyway. And then that's what went, religious freedom went all the way to the Supreme Court.
And who won the case? I don't remember.
The city acquiesced.
Okay.
They paid a huge fine and they altered the zoning regulations. Some very powerful people in town. Sad. Sad but true.
I don't think we would be able to stop. And if we took it out and did not allow it, there would be screams against the
But it
First
wouldn't have to,
Amendment.
but it's still permitted in a residence?
Well, I think the whole thing with the residential area is that typically in this area, you had your churches built within the residential areas.
As churches, but people weren't using their homes as churches.
Well,
It's a,
that becomes a whole, doesn't that, that then becomes a home occupation, that kind of shifts the category? Seems to me that this is building a church or taking a building and converting it into a church or a parish house, as opposed to using your residence as a church. That's an accessory use, so that's a different set of rules.
this is used for regularly attended religious services, and I will tell you that under the IBC building code, because it's a place of assembly, that there'll be a different building code. It will not, you will have to do a lot of different things that you don't have to do in residence.
Right, they're gonna have to.
Now, what about the parish house?
Parish house is different. I mean, parish house is.
Isn't
It's a
that like,
residence.
isn't
It
that like,
doesn't even
right,
need to be
that's like where the
listed.
priests
Where the
live
priest
for,
would live,
Yeah, that's where the
or the
priest
minister or
would-
whatever.
and it's usually not, well,
It's a residential.
sometimes it can be attached to the church, but it's
Yeah.
usually a separate building.
It's become more and more a separate building. But you're right, it used to be attached to the church, and I think that was the issue. The church was a non-residential use. You put parish house with that, so you could have somebody occupying a non-residential use. That's why they've always been kind of together. Although it's becoming less and less, that's less and less the
I didn't mean to digress, it was just a bugaboo.
No, we digress all the time.
Yep.
But
That's how you,
we cover
that's
the
how you
bases.
walk,
Yeah.
that's how you walk through things and make sure that we try
Cover
to
everything.
cover the bases.
So the next one down, other than that, is the daycare home.
That's 6 kids or less.
Okay, so you'll have to specify that, so.
But you said that's its own ordinance too, right?
That's a
So do you
conditional
just put an asterisk there and direct people to
Is
someplace
the
else?
6 kids or less, like, under the definition of it, is that where it is?
That's a DHS definition.
Well, we might wanna put it in ours just in
It
case.
is, I think
everybody-
it is.
Yeah, that's all.
It
That's
should
what
be.
I was asking.
Yeah,
It is.
it should be 6. There it is.
Yeah.
I know it's supposed to. Page 10.
Yep.
Daycare.
3 to 12 kids.
Oh, yeah, it is 3 to 12. That's right.
Population is
They upped it.
Daycare's
It it's 13 or more. That's right. You know, there was a third category that had only 6.
Well, I like the idea of only 6 because we're talking about the R1 zone. A densely residential neighborhood.
Which is a perfect place to put a daycare.
For,
Yeah, it
for
is.
less than 6
Well,
kids.
where are
But
all the
if
kids
it's 12,
in the
we're-
residential
But
areas?
doesn't that also depend upon the
Well, you
size,
got,
size of the building and the amount of property the kids have to mess around on?
and look at the next one.
Yeah,
Next
isn't
one's
there,
an
isn't there a
educational
requirement that
facility,
there be so
school.
much outside property
Yeah,
for every kid? Isn't that part of the requirement,
What's that?
when you're having daycare? Don't you have to have so much space
Yes, per kid.
outside
Yep,
as well as inside for
Yep.
each child?
and it's gonna be fenced in, it has to have top latches and all
Right,
that
so-
good stuff.
Okay.
So that in itself is gonna
Limit it.
restrict what size of, what property you're on.
Yeah.
You can't put it on a half an acre if you have 10 kids, cause you won't have enough.
And just keep in mind, this is all conditional use, right? This
Yeah.
all gets reviewed
Yeah.
by the planning board. Conditions will be placed on this operation of all of these uses.
Okay.
Oh, I don't have an issue with it here. I'm just making sure that I clarify that that's what the rules are.
Educational facility, public, private, or parochial school.
That's
Do we
an
want them-
interesting one.
Do we want them in R1
Where's MLB?
Why
Are you
not?
R1 or R2?
or 2?
Okay, just checking.
I think that was in there originally because MLD school was in the R1 originally.
I think that's why that's there, yes.
Can't think of any other reason. why
But
it would
if
be
you were
there.
going to build another, if somebody wanted to put in a private school, wouldn't it make sense to put it where the people live?
I agree.
So, yeah,
No, cause they're gonna want their kids to know someplace else. Get them away this thing. Take them to another town.
I don't see the harm in leaving that,
I
because
agree.
A, the odds are it's not going to happen, and B,
No,
even
with
if
the
it
cost of
does,
building one,
even if it does, it's a
Good luck.
logical place to put a
To
school.
put in
And
a
it's a
residential
conditional
neighborhood
use.
is exactly
Right.
what we want.
Yeah,
What about filling an earth moving activity greater than 100 cubic yards?
sure.
Trying to figure out what the dickens you can do.
What, for greater than 100 yards? Yeah. Not associated, what, if you look at it, it's not associated with a building permit. So that means if you're, it's always been kind of a weird thing. If you're deciding I'm gonna fill that ditch down behind, you know, or if I'm gonna fill this piece of land here, I wanna eventually cut it off and produce it, making another building lot,
Oh, okay.
you know, but I'm not gonna do it now, and I'm not gonna pull a building permit now. That's why it's in there.
Yeah, okay.
When was the last time one came to you guys?
No, I don't think we've ever
I
seen that.
guarantee you, every permit, I sit down and talk to these guys, they make sure it's 90 yards. Every time they pull that permit, it's 90 yards. Nobody gets crazy enough to go 99, it's 90 yards. One truck less,
And then,
and they come back in for another one next.
Yep.
So,
pet daycare centers, has already been dealt with, how it ended up here.
yeah. Yeah, that was originally just in commercial districts. But now we gotta do our one.
okay, and then leave just the pier dock, take the rest of it out.
Yeah.
Permanent.
Utility stays,
I don't think we have a choice
Right.
in public utilities.
out of my recollection.
It's probably not a good idea, so tell CMP you can't put their power.
Well, it's not just CMP, it would be the
No, it's-
telephone.
It's telephone,
cable.
it's water, it's
Yeah.
KKW. Someday, you know, ASD. Water Sewer District.
Recreation
my lifetime.
facilities, parks and
Mine.
recreation.
You never know. I don't know. Yeah, Parks and Recs, that's a public.
Yep.
I don't know whether they're called Parks and Rec, but it's a public recreational facility, or a private recreational facility open to the public. Residential care facility, that's the interesting one.
I don't think it belongs in the R1.
That's
Yeah, and-
Possibly in the
and
2, 3,
The
or
other
4,
thing
but
is,
not
is
really.
I don't know what you have for a
Right.
definition of recreational.
It's-
Well,
Oh, are you in recreational or residential?
Residential, sorry.
residential.
Residential care facility.
Residential structure which, well, there you go, that's private. Residential structure which provides shelter and support services as an integral function of the facility. This term does not include a correctional pre-release facility or shelter and services to family members related by blood, marriage, or adoption.
I wouldn't think that it would.
What is
So
that?
a resident, don't you wonder who wrote this stuff?
I do, but,
A residential
it's
structure,
like
which
4
was-
different planners took a stab at it too, what are the
Um,
dates?
And
Well,
this
And
definition
it still
is-
doesn't make
A
sense.
residential structure which provides shelter and support services as an integral function of the facility. That's what it is.
That could be
Well, you know
Except
what, you know what they
correction
are. No, well, no, that's where, that's what they're calling these places that they're opening for opioid addiction.
Shelter and support services for.
They're called residential care facilities.
So this is like,
Up to 5 animal
Yeah,
units.
okay.
There you go. We
so
can
this
come
is,
up
Problem
this is
solved. Well, no,
We got 5
there's,
animals.
tell me what the difference is,
Okay.
I need to know that one.
all right, the difference between a sober home and the residential facility is that in a sober home, they're living in the house like they're just living in a house. And they go someplace else for their drug services and their treatment.
Okay.
It's usually not done in the sober home. But the sober home is usually connected to a non-residential
Excuse me.
treatment facility. So
Okay.
there's a residential treatment facility and a non-residential treatment facility. One allows them to live there, one doesn't allow them to live there. So what happens is you have like a building, if you wanna, I can give you names of some to go look at on the internet. But there's also other types of residential facilities. There could be residential facilities for older people.
Yeah.
And that's why I wanted to know, it depends on what our definition of a residential facility is. That definition
Open end.
will allow for them to come here, and the problem is this doesn't belong. If you were doing a residential facility for older people, or for somebody who, say, they were autistic or had mental challenges,
Mhm.
that would be different,
Or even hospice, something like
or
that.
hospice.
Hmm.
Yes, but the way this is worded, it would allow for what they call a residential facility, which means the druggies come in,
Mhm.
And never go
they
away.
live there, but they're free to come and go.
So they're not kept on the site.
No.
This isn't like Milestone or Gray Manor or some
With
of those.
most of your residential facilities, they reside there, but they're not limited to the building.
They have the ability to drive themselves places?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that's
See, I would-
different than Milestone.
I would take the position that even if it were elderly people that were living here, I don't think it's appropriate in the R1.
Well,
Why?
Because again, we're looking at a densely residential area. Put them in the R2, put them in the R3. I don't think in the 1 acre zone for densely residential, the way the comp plan has it spread out is appropriate.
But they
if-
weren't, sorry.
But if you have a densely populated residential area with little kids who don't have grandparents nearby, something like this with elderly people would be perfect for both sets.
Something like this
Agreed.
with elderly people would encourage the elderly people to wander away from the residential care facility because they wanna go see the little kids.
but you have to
Okay.
understand that, okay. I think if you go look at your residential facilities for your aging, okay, they're still able to get about. They're not like, they're not usually at a sniff level where they're,
Are you talking about assisted living? Which is different than residential care.
Maybe what we need is just a better definition for
Much better
residential care
I
facility.
think we need to
Because
get rid
this
of
is
that and
awful.
tell, and
Yeah.
say what we want.
Yeah.
Yes.
right,
You know, what do we
Agreed.
want in this district instead of trying to work with this unworkable definition?
right, because what happens now is that they just pop up
Yeah.
everywhere. And I don't think that that's, number one, I don't think it's a good mix for the town in general, but it's certainly not a good mix for someplace where there is a lot of kids
Right.
and a lot of residences.
So if you were talking about an assisted living facility, I would think differently than I do about residential care. Residential care makes me think of a nursing home.
Yeah,
And
that's what I
I'm
was
not sure
thinking.
that that's appropriate in the R1 zone.
Well,
Assisted
assisted living
living.
is,
Assisted living, they get up, they go on their own, they have their own cars, they travel around, they're coming back because they've got some kind of a medical requirement that needs them to have
But usually it
access.
doesn't take place in a residence.
It doesn't.
No, assisted living, you know, they have
Oh,
small
Oh,
apartments
no, no, they have them
or-
all over the place, they're in residence all over the place, you go look at
Well,
some of them in Portland,
It wouldn't
Scarborough,
have
they're in
necessarily
residential
have to
areas.
be a residence as in an existing house, but it could be in a residential area as a separate building. You could have a facility with, 10 units that housed people with either physical limitations or age limitations.
But I thought the definition of R1 was a residential.
That's gonna be
Well,
somewhat
well, what
limited,
do
isn't
what do you call that?
But it also allows for multifamily dwellings. This would be
which
no.
is that, which is what we're talking about.
Right, this
the
would be no
assisted
different,
living aspect.
different than that.
And also many, I don't know if it's any longer this way, but when they first started off, assisted care facilities were actually sort of a hierarchical kind of system where you started off in cottages.
A lot of them are.
And then you can move on to the main building where you have more intense residential care. And eventually you get to the Alzheimer's unit or the hospice
Right.
situation.
That's the.
So
that's-
there's a graduated,
And it's all,
it's all on the same grounds, if you will, but different buildings,
That's
same
the,
grounds.
that's the current model that is being developed all over the country, where you own that cottage.
Right.
And
So
when you can no longer live on your own, you go into the assisted living, and then you transition into the nursing home.
Correct.
And so you're with the same people, you're with your same friends,
You're on the same
Same
property.
staff.
you're on the same
More or less.
staff.
Isn't R1, or, this is an interesting definition of R1, because every place that I have been involved with or known about, R1 has always meant single-family housing.
Yes.
But we've tried, the discussion's always been, we have large lots of land available in the R1 zone. We want to accommodate
So,
those pieces of property as well.
so duplexes all of a sudden are permitted in an R1 facility.
And the other rationale here is because this is supposed to eventually be the most densely populated area. If you were going to have a place where there were, an opportunity for elderly people to live within walking distance of perhaps a store or something else, or, some sort of recreational facility. And so this all sort of fits together as a community within a community, for lack of a better description.
Well, I'm sort of, with Rich, that R1 is residential, less, and not necessarily commercial, but it's a conditional use, so it would have to come before the
Yeah.
board.
So
Right.
it would have to be on a suitable sized piece of property.
Right, with a
appropriate.
suitable number of rooms and, you
Yeah.
know,
Right, because each time you add a unit, you have to add acreage. So
so,
you can't
It's not going on a 1 acre
But
lot.
if we're
Right.
gonna do that, we need to eliminate it here and come up with a better definition.
Yes.
So why not,
That's-
strike out residential care facility out of there?
I would.
And, number one, and number two, add a definition that would allow something like an assisted care facility.
And that was in the comp plan.
Right, so take it out here,
We could do that.
which I think would be better.
For right now, we can strike it out and we can add that in at some point. We can work out the definitions.
Cause I don't have any trouble with assisted living, I don't even care if it has a 3-tier.
No, I'm just saying, when people buy property and they build their home in an R1 area, they expect it to be residences and not all these other commercial enterprises.
That's where you get to the density, how many units can you have per acre total?
And even with assisted living, I've been to a couple of them, the assisted living facilities are like going to like a big homestead.
Yeah,
It's,
no,
it's,
I know
Some
what
of
they
them,
are, I'm
yes.
very
Right.
familiar with what they are, I'm
Some,
just saying.
some are like that, some are not so much.
yeah, but what I don't wanna see is, and I'll just say, I don't wanna see an area where the elderly don't feel welcome, or we're not making accommodations for, especially since we're a state with a lot of,
But it doesn't
people
have
over a
to be
certain
in an
age.
R1 zone.
Right.
Yeah,
that's not-
but why not?
Yeah, I think.
Cause
we
it's
should-
residential.
Not only that, that's where they're gonna be sidewalks and, you know,
Connections
It's
to
just-
downtown.
Yeah.
right.
And that's where we can all be meeting in another 20 years while we work on this.
We might have a definition by then.
That's right.
Tom, Tom will lead the way for
I
us.
think
Well,
we
that's
have
for
to be
sure.
careful
One of these
about
nice
what
numbers.
we,
Well, so far.
what permitted
Well,
uses
yeah.
are in
Okay.
Yeah, so
residential districts.
I would suggest that we remove the residential care facility and put something in there, you know, I don't care if we put assisted living as a conditional use, I think it's a good
Why
idea.
do we have to put anything in this and leave it in someplace else in the, in our documentation about assisted living, care
Well, we
facilities,
could-
whatever?
Cat can add it onto the list of things that the planning board has to address and deal with, and we can go through.
I'm
You
gonna
gotta put it
define.
somewhere though. You gotta
Yeah.
put
Yeah,
this,
define it.
this facility, we gotta put this concept somewhere.
Well, we
The question is, where's the best location? We thought that would be good in a dense residential area, cause that's where you're gonna start putting sidewalks and
Okay.
Right.
and
So
trails and so forth that.
Now, are you talking about the residential or the assisted?
Assisted
Assisted.
living. Yeah, residential, I think is gone.
So let's.
Oh, yeah.
Residential's gone, cause it's too dangerously
Roger.
amorphous.
Oh,
Do you
yes.
think- Do you think it would be appropriate to put into a conditional use in the R1?
Yep.
Jens?
Assisted living? Yes, absolutely.
Susan?
The jury's still out for me, I'd have to think about it.
Diane?
I'm sorry, yeah, that's Don over there,
I would put it in.
okay.
I mean, it's a conditional use, you're gonna look at
Okay,
it.
then we'll put it in. Cause, you know, push comes to shove, I have a feeling that there's one of us that would say, no, it doesn't belong, and there might be two. But that's fine, if you guys feel it's appropriate to put it in, we'll put it in.
It's okay with me?
And we'll
Good.
work up the definitions and how that all comes together.
The question is, how do we prevent it from becoming convalescent?
That's stuff that we're gonna have to work on.
But,
And we can
but
do-
even that doesn't really, and what's gonna restrict it, just so that you know, what's gonna restrict it is the fact that there is no water and sewer.
That is true.
That will restrict the size, it will restrict where it goes.
Yep.
But at least it's there, so say somebody wanted to do a smaller scale assisted living, they could. Because you could do that with a well and you could do that with a septic system.
I think that's where we're
But-
going. I think
But
we're
I
going
think,
very
but I think that you will find that they will not put large scale ones in,
Not without sewer.
not without sewer, not without water. You'll see that more out if we ever get sewer up by Route 1. You'll see them pushing out, but if you have any R1s out by where they're gonna put where they have water and where they have sewer, then you may see them wanna put one of these in. But I think that will restrict it for most of the town. Because they go through a lot of water and a lot of sewer.
Yes, they would.
The last one that we're looking at is residential multifamily.
Well, you know how I feel, it should be single-family houses, but I understand it's Arundel and it's not in the middle of Los Angeles, so I'll defer to everybody else's judgment, but.
Well, the issue is we don't have any real apartments in this, the best we've got is Rose Terrace.
But maybe you limit it to duplexes and triplexes and not to, you know,
Large buildings.
large buildings. Because we're all about trying to maintain, I'm not gonna use the word character, but
Go ahead. No, it's
we're
good.
gonna,
No,
we're
I'm not
trying to
offended by that.
maintain
It's
the
just- it's
character.
the definition.
And once you know, multifamily implies something completely different than
Yes.
duplexes and triplexes, which can be done, you know, very tastefully and make them, you know, fit into the neighborhood.
So where they go,
Well,
are they not gonna have any in around
well, once again, they're gonna be restricted.
Well,
But
but
water and
I mean,
sewers is gonna be the big issue.
Water and sewer is gonna be an issue, plus, even though you're building a multifamily, the multifamily still falls under that rule, don't you have to have X number of acreage
Yes,
for
you will,
each?
yeah.
but why does it have to be in R1? Why, aren't there other districts that are close to, for instance, we're trying to develop Route 1, we want restaurants there, we want shops there, we want people,
Actually,
to walk
multifamily is
and-
allowed out there.
and so those are the
Associated with
places
business.
where you really want, you know, larger, established multifamily apartment buildings, things like that, because people gravitate towards places where there are services
How many can
markets
they build?
and,
Do
you
we have a
know,
limit?
post
so
offices and,
PB2?
and pharmacies and McDonald's and
It's one
Sebago
per acre.
Brewing
Why would
Company
you
and
do
all these other things. They wanna be able to walk there, but they're not gonna walk on Senate Road because there's no sidewalks. So they're gonna get hit by a car and that's gonna be the end of them.
That solves the problem.
And,
Not necessarily.
And it's- okay,
But you know what
it's-
I'm saying?
Yes, I do, and
Okay.
I don't know that I disagree with you.
Yeah, you know, there is some legs to that. Right now, we do encourage multifamily in the DB1 and DB2 districts associated with business.
Yep.
You can have, in the DB1, you can have residential to your heart's content on the upper floors. First floor is business. It's kind of an urban model, it's a Jane Jacobs model, but, you know, if you have an incentive, and we have an incentive in there, if you recall, we put the incentives in there to reduce the density that you needed to put residential multifamily on the second floor or the third floor of a commercial
And it's
building.
very common, it's, as, you know, Tad is right, it's happening all over the place, but the other thing is that, one drives the development of the other. So if you have, demand, more businesses will come.
Yeah.
And if you have businesses, there'll be more demand for residences and, you know, apartments and multifamily, you know, what do you call them, I guess, communities that will drive and support those businesses, so one feeds the other. And not to talk about Los Angeles, but there's an area called the Grove, which is photographed and the entertainment tonight is there. Well, along this, what they found was that there was, people wanted to live closer to the center of the city because there was so much traffic and things like that. So one developer developed all these different apartment buildings at all different price points as renters. And it drove the development of the farmer's market and the Grove. And as the Grove and the farmer's market, you know, got more popular and it expanded and was more profitable, other businesses around it grew. And then more multifamily housing grew as well. And yet it's surrounded by R1 districts, but the density of the apartments was clustered around all these other, you know, desirable services that people want, cleaners, restaurants, you know, entertainment, shopping, things like that. So to me, building around R1 is the logical place where people can actually go out of their places of residence and walk and go to Bandaloop, for instance, that's being developed now. And, you know, that more of that's gonna happen. That to me is a logical place to put multifamily housing.
Also is more appealing to a younger group too, that has a tendency not to produce as many kids, very honestly, and we were always talking about that.
But what if,
Limiting our school age population.
and I don't mind putting it in like, next to the business districts, the problem is, what I don't wanna see is, I don't want the whole business district to become apartment buildings.
And that's
instead of-
why it's gotta be on
we
the
said
second
it
floor.
Can't be on the
Yeah.
first floor, the
Yeah,
first
well,
floor
have
has
a
to
mixed
be
use
business.
approach.
But even building them in the R1, it's 1 unit per acre? Is
It's
that
not
what it is?
economically feasible.
Right, so
Honestly.
whether you took, and this is how I look at it, you can take 4 acres and you can have house, 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 house. Or you can put one house in the middle with 4.
Right. And your price point's gonna be much better on your 4 houses than it's gonna be for your apartment with 4. You're gonna make a lot more money.
But you're still gonna have the same thing.
Yep.
So it's no different.
But I guess what I'm saying is we wanna develop R1, and we wanna develop more services there, and if you wanna, have them be sympathetic to one another, where one supports the other, it makes perfect sense to put them in close proximity to each other, and not in areas.
The DB2, not
Yes,
R1.
yes, the businesses and the residences, so that they can support each other.
There's no definition for residential multifamily, by the way.
No, there's just one for multifamily.
Development.
Yeah. I know,
So,
another thing we gotta fix.
Right.
But it would still have to have the density per unit, correct?
Yeah,
Just like
and
a-
the density in the DB1, there's a density bonus for doing this in the DB1, it makes it much more economically feasible putting multifamily in the DB1 and the DB2 than it is in the R1. R1, you're gonna be stuck with one unit per acre, and the question is, how are you gonna get that rent structure for 1 unit per acre versus what you can get for a single family home? From an economic standpoint, if you're a developer, you're crazy to do it. So if it's crazy to do it, and we're not gonna give any density bonus for multifamily where we even have it in the district.
and it doesn't help you
Right.
develop the areas that you wanna develop with services. Do you know what I'm saying? So, it's just a different way of looking
Should we
at it.
take it out?
Sounds like we are
Yeah, I take it out.
concluding to take it out.
Yeah.
Right.
Good.
Well,
But that being
Does
said,
it still allow duplexes, or would it take duplexes out as well?
No, duplexes are a different animal, no, duplexes are still in there, single family and, I think where is it? It's up
It's up
above,
and permitted.
it's a permitted use,
Okay.
multifamily is,
Okay.
Yeah.
so,
the only thing that would.
Does
I'm
the
thinking of
does the
age
comp plan
restricted
have
use.
anything about multifamily? In that area?
I'm
Well, we
sorry.
did,
Does the comp plan have anything about multifamily that we have to,
that's a good question,
I think it did.
I'm not sure. Where do we go with these?
I have about 700 of these now.
Yeah, so do I. I keep
I'm giving you
producing
this
more
one
and
back.
more.
Yes.
I just did the stuff that was relevant to, R1. In this set, to make it easy.
Yeah, as well as multifamily dwellings.
God bless you.
Yeah,
Which is what
well, we are
assisted
allowing,
care is.
we are allowing multifamily, we allow duplexes.
No,
No,
it says,
single and
says
two-family
single,
homes.
two-family homes as well as
However, if-
multifamily dwellings.
All right, and working this backwards, if something that makes sense now for the ordinance is in the comp plan and needs to be changed, then the comp plan committee can recommend that change.
Well, I'm wondering, I could have sworn we just put this in.
No,
No, this is
that's
an
been in
old
for a
one.
long time.
That's been there for a while.
That's that, well, the only thing we did in the last 2 rounds was the agritourism and the animal husbandry and that list. So, no, that's not new.
And getting rid
But-
of the NRC district.
All right, so that needs comp plan attention.
So what I would like to do at this point, is say, let's go home. It's
Please.
9:30.
Man, we're on a roll.
I'd like to make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
We've gone through all of the uses in the R1, which is great. I think the issue that I would like to address is rural character related to the R1 district.
Well, that's next, that's performance standards.
The performance, well, no,
And
we
setbacks
need
and
to
stuff.
find out, but that's stuff that we end up putting into play. I just wanna make sure that we understand the comp plan's position on how rural character is defined so that we can look at it when we start putting in our performance standards, and we can look at it and say, this is what you mean. I mean, do we buffer everything for 200 feet from the road so that you don't see any houses? And how do we put that stuff together?
No, I don't think we.
Well, yeah, that's a little bit unrealistic, but.
Except for sex businesses, of course.
That's
Well,
300
sex
feet.
business.
There
I
are
think-
1,000
That
feet.
wouldn't be in
No,
our.
no, I think sex business
No.
and bootleggers
Well, right
were
now,
all
you
part of
can't
the
do it
rural
unless
character.
we put it in a district, you can go, somebody
Yeah.
can force it in.
Well, I'm
Well, I don't
sure
think they
that,
enforce it anywhere, we just gotta allow it somewhere.
Yeah, we would have to, well, what I'm saying, they could come in and say, well, it's a business, we wanna be in the business district, it's retail.
Here,
Might
you
be-
can,
might
you
work
can
in a
only
business,
allow it
that's right.
in this law, in this business district, period.
Yeah, it's in a swamp.
Well, I think if we keep it away from daycares, and we keep it away from churches, and we keep it away from
people who have dogs,
people that have dogs and are right-handed, we should be okay.
We should be good.
And that's usually how it's dealt with. I think we should have another meeting to tackle that issue.
Yes.
Would you folks be amenable to that?
I insist on being here.
Which
It's
issue
just more fun than I
specifically?
usually have.
Well, that's sad.
Really?
That would be dealing with the big issue we keep grappling with is, how do we preserve the real character in a dense environment like R one? Or what do we do to promote a rural feel to our town, to preserve that character that's been there? And still accommodate the kind of development we're talking about. It's gonna be a challenge.
They
Well, I
should
think
never
I think
change
it
it.
has to be,
You'll never get it back up to two.
you
but-
can't do it as a
I thought it
big
was
overlay,
three.
I think you're gonna have to pick
No,
which
that's not my
district or
big-
districts you do.
Right. I'm in that one.
Otherwise, you're just gonna get a
So I'm on
crazy
Cedar Road, right
amalgamation
there.
that doesn't make any sense,
Where are
and you
you
lose
on
the,
Cedar Road?
your objective.
Well, that's the issue I'm having, because the comprehensive, this refers to R one as a
Towards
dense
Cedar Road?
urban area,
Towards Vinegar.
but it wants us
The
to
other
keep
way.
the rural
Okay.
character. I have no idea how to
Have
do
you
that.
been on?
Yeah.
Actually, I don't think it's gonna be as difficult
Yes.
as you think.
Do you know where
It may
Focal
not
Point
be.
is?
But I don't know how to do it.
Right.
One of the reasons we had to have this.
And the house two down.
Yeah, no, and I understand that, I mean,
And then
the
up the
complaint
hill
committee has grappled with that
out to the
concept
little
for
church. There's a road
decades,
on the
literally,
left-hand
so.
side, Thompson Road.
But-
Go up two houses and farm the rest of my
What
land.
you need, so that when we put together the performance standards, we'll have an idea as to
So,
how it's going.
And a lot, that's also gonna come back to some of those larger lots and how they get handled, and that's gonna lead us logically into the
doesn't
animal
have to
husbandry
look
piece.
like
Because that's in effect where some of this started.
Home Depot is and
You know, what can people who have large parcels of land do, whether they are in R one or R two, or R4, that makes sense for the
I'm
neighbors.
talking about.
Yeah,
we're
it
talking
goes
about
back to that,
multifamily
where we
housing.
started this meeting.
It doesn't have to
Don't
be as
impact the neighbors
commercial.
adversely,
But one of the things
do what you want.
is that we don't have
You know,
all the
and setbacks have a lot to do with that as well as lot size.
You can be
And
very
then-
thoughtful about it.
It is.
Very
Yeah,
charming.
that's the- I think that's gonna be
And
one
you
of
don't
our
wanna
most
be
difficult
Yeah.
places to
souvenir
address
shops,
this
like
issue,
something that
because
would
we're
be
talking
fun.
about density.
But.
I mean, the other
It'll
thing-
get easier as we get farther out and more creative as we
Yeah,
get.
it's just.
Yes. And the other thing,
Yeah,
for
like
the
top
planning
those are
board
pop-up
members in the
businesses.
beginning
You know,
of
it
the,
could be more like a
comp
Kennebunk,
plan.
more like a.
not just the
Take
sections that
photos
are here, but if you have the
or-
whole document,
It could be.
we define
Yeah,
rural
it's
character.
Full of character.
And it's
but
not
yet
just a matter of, you know, trees and
upscale.
bushes and
Well,
open fields.
Bitterford's going through a
There's
huge
more to it
renaissance
than
right
that.
now.
And a lot of that
And
definition,
they're
which
not
has to do
really
with
controlling it
attitudes
as-
and,
They're not controlling it as well. as
culture,
they
yeah, thank you.
probably should.
will fit very nicely with our one. And to some extent, we addressed that a little bit tonight, with things like, you know, no, we don't want apartment buildings in R one. That would detract from rural character. So-
Some of the communities that off line 495, they are,
Hopefully you make them pay it.
some of them are
Portland, you pay for the.
quite affluent communities, but
There is no
I
parking.
think they sort of have the feel
It's
that,
kinda crazy.
I used to work in
what
Portland.
we may be
We had
looking
our own
for.
garage, but I never
They have
did that.
concentrated button of a town, but outlying that is a lot of the natural, still old farms and older homes and just a nice feel, like Harvard and Oxford and the Littleton area, Acton.
Part of of our difficulty though is because of the way the town started, how it grew naturally, and then how it was completely screwed up by whoever drew that map. Those districts are.
I drew that
Right.
map.
No, you didn't.
No, you did not.
But we have the name of the man who did. Some of the.
Believe me. we
the-
did.
And he's left town.
He's left,
he
he's
now
left
lives- he now
almost
lives
the
on the left
country.
coast.
Oh, he lives
Really?
on the left coast?
Yes, he does,
So-
and that's not quite far enough away. But, I mean, the R1, R2, R3 districts were badly conceived.
I never really understood them. Why,
There
why,
you go.
why do we
That's
have to?
because, oh, well, you know, the state says we had to do this, and it was pretty much crammed down our throats.
Yeah.
Well, he was right when he said that, but it's not how you can also, I mean, I did, if I'm repeating myself, slap me, but I worked, thank you. The town of Branford, which is just north of, Bangor, they were a very small rural community, undergoing some suburbanization, but they had to do their complaint. And they really didn't have a town center. It was a bit of farming community, and they didn't have a town center, they had a kind of a loop of roads. And, when I met with them, they said, how do we do this? I don't know how to do this, you know, we have, in some cases, miles between houses. How are we gonna create the growth district? You know, how are we gonna create this one area where the growth isn't and all the rest of it is rural? And we got a variance from them on that. I applied to and I got a variance from them having to do with growth
I told them to tell the
district.
state to pound sand.
Well,
Well, the problem, here's the problem, they took the money.
Yeah,
When you
So-
take the money, you gotta play by their game. Now, I don't know if you guys took the money.
Well, I still think that we
Then
would have
that's
had
why.
some latitude in some of the stuff that he told us we had to do.
Well, you know, that, and I.
does that mean
can't-
it's not changeable ever?
Oh, well,
No,
no,
of course it's
that
changeable.
was where I was going with my initial statement.
it's
I
changeable.
think part of the solution to some of the nitty gritty problems we're going to run into will be to change some of those lines. Because some of them simply make no sense.
Agreed.
The fact that we have some of the very large parcels where they are in what are supposed to be more densely populated areas, that's the mistake that started the whole problem. So if we can somehow jury rig that and straighten some of that out, that I think might be very welcomed. You know, the last round of the comp plan, we attempted to do that, as I said, when we met with some residents who had split lots and who were on borderlines, like between R1 and R4, and said, what would you like to do? And that was the first time anybody ever asked them, what would you like to do? Because otherwise they were just told, well, the line runs right here through your porch. So we might be able to solve some of that if we're creative and adventurous.
The problem is, in some cases, some people might find that their density
And
Well,
so,
goes up,
You're never gonna
increases,
get
or decreases,
a
excuse
consent,
me.
you know.
And that's where the rub is, because
Yeah.
that's a financial impact on people.
Well,
They're making plans,
yeah,
they bought a piece of land, property, they have a plan for the future with it, and now suddenly, oh, we're requiring you to decrease your density.
I was just gonna say, it's not the density going up, it'll be the density going down.
It's the density going
problem.
down, that's the
Right.
problem.
But doesn't mean, some of it can't be accomplished cooperatively.
Right,
Some improvement is better than none.
yes.
So I heard Three Sisters was sold too. Did you hear that? Up on
Three Sisters.
The
the,
Biddeford,
on the
next
way
to the
to
Biddeford Industrial Park.
right,
Oh,
going to Biddeford.
oh,
Used to be
And
the-
some famous,
Yeah, it used to be
well-known
the
chef.
Dido.
oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So I mean, those kinds of things, Bandaloop and whatever, other businesses will be attracted to it if more come. You know, if you build it, they will come. Let's hope so.
And if you don't build it, they will stay away, and
That's
something to be
exactly
said for
right.
that too.
There was somebody trying to buy Fritz's too, I can't remember what that was.
Now, that's a,
That's why you got a miniature golf.
miniature
Miniature
golf.
golf.
Oh, in the New York Times, they just had a big article about
Well, that'll
the
mix in
success
well with
rate
people
of
up the street.
amusements like that.
Shouldn't affect them too badly.
It-
No,
It's
I'm
not
saying
high.
it makes us well, they can go to.
So-
You're not gonna get rich doing it, but this is vacation land.
No, those kids spent a lot of money trying to get that thing off the ground. And they still don't own the property yet, do they?
Do we know?
No, we just went over that with them today, we found a problem
Oh
with
my
the
God, they
deed?
spent a fortune.
Is it this third Thursday is, I keep
Your
canceling
problem?
historical
Yeah, the
society meetings
deed.
for you.
With a deed,
Yeah, well, you know, Fritz's Lane,
Yeah.
that's not an easement, they own it in fee, and now that fee goes across the part
Third
of the
Thursday
land,
would be the
divides it
20th
up,
of December.
and therefore
That's
creates
what we're
two
looking at.
lots. It creates all these
Unless you
little
guys aren't
illegal
doing anything.
lots.
Oh, God.
Well, then that's even more.
Dick did a lot of jerry rigging out
Oh,
there.
yeah.
And the
His legacy.
attorney did not exactly clean it up.
Could we have a-
So they got a long way to go before they.
It's not a long way, it's simple, I told him very simple, just move the boundary line along the, what was an easement, and it isn't, it's a right of way with meets and bounds, they own the land, it's
Oh,
on
right, I'm sorry.
fee.
I-
So, how did that come
Yes.
from? I
Part
said,
of the second
you
one.
tell them the boundary line goes along that.
Our next meeting?
Since you don't return phone calls,
Who did you call?
3 of them,
I never,
Our-
never refused.
3.
When? When?
Seriously, what?
I
Yeah.
called you and said,
What does
They
December
can't repeat
20th
this.
look like for the next
call
meeting?
me, I wanna
The
talk to
third-
you about my email
December
address. I
20th.
called you
December
again and
20th. It's a
said, I
Thursday.
need you to
For this
update my
meeting?
email
For this
address.
meeting.
I can't even email you.
December 20.
Do you know that?
On these
Thursday?
invites.
I can't.
We don't have
Oh.
a planning board meeting then?
No, we have one.
I'm not
before,
getting the
on
invites to
13th.
these meetings because it's going to my old email
Okay.
address.
Fine with me?
I thought I fixed that.
No, because the only
Yeah,
way
it's
I
cool.
know about
We'll send it out to the.
I'm not
Alright, so
getting
the
it.
20th, okay, then I'll get the historical society
Nope.
meet on Tuesday that week instead of
Okay.
No, I
Thursday.
said I.
Thank you much, Jens.
Yahoo.com.
Yeah,
you
it's
too.
on there.
I get the
Have a
planning
good night.
board meetings,
But you're not
but I'm
getting
not
these?
getting these.
Wow, okay, I'll get that.
Thank you.
Take a look down. We're looking at December 20th for the next one, the third.
I'm taking all kinds of vacation time. I had all kinds of vacation time banked and it's use it or lose it, you can only
Yeah,
carry
well,
40
that-
hours, and so I took every Friday off, and now
taken
took
care of.
a year, I'm out.
I think that might be